Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Psychiatric hospitals in the 70s weren't what people imagine today. They were isolated fortresses, where experimental treatments happened behind locked doors and nobody asked questions. My residency at Clearwater Psychiatric Institute started right after medical school, when 26 still felt old enough to change the world, but young enough to trust the wrong people. The facility occupied 40 acres of pine forest in Northern California, about 2 hours from Sacramento, housing 300 patients separated into wings based on diagnosis and severity. Dr. Gregory Hoffman ran the women's ward where I'd been assigned, a man approaching his 60s with silver hair perpetually slicked back, and these pale gray eyes that held your gaze without blinking, like he was reading something written on the inside of your skull. My duties seemed routine at first: patient evaluations, medication rounds, behavioral documentation, all the standard tasks that would supposedly prepare me for running my own practice one day. The other residents complained about the isolation, the outdated equipment, the way certain doors stayed locked even to medical staff, but I figured every hospital had its quirks and protocols. Everything shifted one October evening when Dr. Hoffman kept me after my shift ended, leading me through parts of the building my keycard had never opened before. We passed 2 security checkpoints, where guards examined special clearance badges I didn't know existed, then descended a stairwell into a basement corridor with no windows and fluorescent tubes that buzzed like angry wasps trapped in the ceiling. He explained I'd been selected for a classified research project with federal funding, revolutionary trauma treatment that could transform our understanding of how the human mind processes and releases psychological damage. The way he presented it felt almost religious. We would administer controlled doses of lysergic acid diethylamide to female patients with severe emotional trauma, using the drug's properties to essentially dissolve the barriers their minds had built around traumatic memories, allowing us to guide them through reprocessing these experiences in a controlled therapeutic environment. He produced a manila folder thick with consent forms, each one signed and notarized, assuring me that every legal requirement had been satisfied, though the sensitive nature of the research meant absolute discretion, even from colleagues who weren't part of what he called the project team. The first session I observed took place in a room they'd converted from an old surgical theater. White walls, one-way observation glass, and a reclining chair that looked more like a dentist's setup than anything psychiatric. The patient was Diane, 32 years old, admitted for severe depression after losing her daughter in a drowning accident 3 years prior. Dr. Hoffman administered the LSD through a sugar cube, precisely dosed at 200 micrograms, while I monitored her vitals and took notes on the special forms they'd designed for the project. Within 40 minutes, Diane's pupils dilated until her brown eyes looked almost black, and she began describing colors bleeding through the walls like watercolors in rain. Dr. Hoffman guided her with this steady hypnotic voice, asking her to revisit the day of the accident, to walk through it frame by frame while the drug dismantled whatever defensive walls her mind had built. She started crying, then laughing, then making these sounds I'd never heard from a human throat, something between singing and wailing that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. What disturbed me wasn't just the intensity of her reaction, but how Dr. Hoffman responded to it, leaning forward with this expression of fascination while scribbling notes in shorthand I couldn't read. He increased the dose for the next session without consulting me, pushing it to 350 micrograms, explaining that we needed to break through the resistance to reach the actual trauma. During that second session, Diane clawed at her arms until she drew blood, convinced that insects were crawling beneath her skin, carrying messages from her dead daughter. I wanted to intervene, to give her something to calm the hallucinations, but Dr. Hoffman grabbed my wrist and held it with surprising strength, telling me that interrupting the process would invalidate months of preparation. 2 other doctors I'd never seen before watched from behind the observation glass, taking their own notes, occasionally speaking into tape recorders they held close to their mouths. By the 3rd week, we had 12 women participating in the project, each one dealing with different traumas: sexual assault, childhood abuse, loss of children, domestic violence that had left both physical and psychological scars. The sessions grew longer, sometimes stretching 8 or 9 hours, with doses that would have been considered dangerous in any legitimate therapeutic setting. Dr. Hoffman introduced what he called guided reconstruction, where he would suggest new narratives while the patients were deep in their hallucinations, trying to overwrite their traumatic memories with fabricated ones. He'd tell a woman who'd been raped that it had been a dream, that she'd actually spent that night safe in her childhood bedroom, and in their altered state, some of them would begin to believe it, at least temporarily. The morning after these sessions, the confusion in their eyes when reality reasserted itself was painful to witness. They'd look at me like drowning people reaching for something solid, but I had no answers that would help them make sense of what was real anymore. The night everything went wrong, we were working with a patient named Janet, a 28-year-old who'd been admitted after multiple suicide attempts following a miscarriage. She'd been in the program for 2 weeks, and Dr. Hoffman had been pushing her doses higher each session, convinced he was close to what he called a breakthrough moment. That evening, he gave her 500 micrograms, more than double a standard therapeutic dose, while soft classical music played through speakers mounted in the ceiling corners. For the first hour, Janet lay still on the reclined chair, her eyes moving rapidly behind closed lids like she was in REM sleep, occasionally mumbling words I couldn't make out. Then her breathing changed, becoming these deep rhythmic pants like a woman in labor, and her hands moved to her stomach, pressing and kneading the flesh through her hospital gown. Dr. Hoffman leaned forward in his chair, that familiar gleam of fascination brightening his gray eyes as he began speaking to Janet in a low, measured tone, telling her she was safe, that she was bringing life into the world, that everything was happening exactly as it should. Janet's movements became more agitated, her fingers clawing at the hospital gown until she'd torn it open, revealing her pale stomach covered in old self-harm scars that looked like a map of her suffering. She kept repeating, "The baby's coming, the baby's coming," her voice rising with each repetition until it became a shriek that echoed off the white walls. I reached for the sedatives we kept prepared, but Dr. Hoffman raised his hand to stop me, insisting we needed to let the experience complete itself, that interrupting now would cause psychological fragmentation. Behind the observation glass, the 2 unnamed doctors had pressed closer, one of them filming with a small camera I hadn't noticed before, capturing every moment of Janet's unraveling. What happened next still appears in my nightmares, vivid as the moment I witnessed it. Janet's fingers, still convinced she was delivering a child, began tearing at her abdomen with her fingernails, ripping through skin with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. Blood spread across the white leather of the chair, pooling beneath her, and she was laughing. This horrible, joyous laughter like she'd accomplished something miraculous. Dr. Hoffman finally moved then, but not to help her. He grabbed my shoulders and positioned me between himself and Janet, using me as a shield while shouting for the security guards. By the time they restrained her and I managed to stop the bleeding with compression and emergency sutures, she'd carved deep gashes across her stomach, muttering about holding her baby, asking why we'd taken it away when she'd worked so hard to bring it back. The aftermath was chaos disguised as protocol. Nurses appeared from nowhere to transfer Janet to the medical wing. Documents were signed and countersigned, and Dr. Hoffman spoke in hushed tones with the observers who packed up their recording equipment with practiced efficiency. Nobody would tell me Janet's condition beyond stable, and when I tried to check on her the next morning, I found her room empty, the bed stripped down to the mattress, no record in the system that she'd ever been transferred to medical. Dr. Hoffman called me into his office that afternoon, sliding a stack of papers across his mahogany desk, a non-disclosure agreement that went on for pages, full of legal language about federal classification and penalties for unauthorized disclosure that included prison time. He reminded me about my student loans, about how the project's funding included a generous bonus that would clear my debts, about how my participation would be noted favorably in my residency evaluation. His gray eyes never blinked as he explained that Janet had been transferred to a specialized facility for intensive care, that her family had been notified, that everything was being handled according to established protocols. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, about the 11 other women still in the program, about the doses that kept climbing, and the observers with their cameras and tape recorders. That night, I snuck back into the restricted wing using my access card, planning to copy patient files to find some evidence of what was really happening. The filing room was exactly where I expected, but when I opened the cabinet marked with our project code, I found something that made my chest tighten with panic. Hundreds of files, dating back years before the program supposedly started, each one documenting similar experiments with different drugs, different methods, but always the same focus on female patients with trauma. The earliest files were from 1965, and at the bottom of each one was a stamp I recognized from news articles about congressional hearings. MK Ultra Subproject 58, Psychochemical Vulnerability Studies. I grabbed as many files as I could carry, stuffing them into my medical bag, knowing I had minutes before security did their rounds. The documents painted a picture of systematic experimentation that made my stomach churn. Women who'd been given massive doses of LSD combined with electroshock therapy, others subjected to sensory deprivation while hallucinating, detailed notes about personality reconstruction and memory dissolution that read more like science fiction than medicine. One file contained photographs that I wish I could forget. Women with vacant eyes, some catatonic, others clearly in states of permanent psychosis, all marked as project outcomes unsuccessful. The most recent file was dated just 3 days ago, and when I opened it, Janet's admission photo stared back at me. But the status section was stamped with something that made no sense. Subject relocated, Montreal facility, further testing required. I photographed everything with the small camera I'd bought for documenting patient progress, my fingers trembling so badly I had to retake several shots. The next morning, I arrived at work to find my keycard deactivated and 2 federal agents waiting in the lobby with Dr. Hoffman, who wouldn't meet my eyes as they explained I was being transferred immediately to a VA hospital in Texas, that my residency would continue there with full credit, that my moving expenses would be covered. They made it clear this wasn't a request. My apartment had already been packed, my belongings were in a truck, and a plane ticket was waiting at the airport. The agents escorted me to my car, one of them mentioning casually that they knew about my late-night visit to the filing room, that the cameras had captured everything, but they were willing to overlook it if I honored my agreements and relocated quietly. Dr. Hoffman disappeared 2 days after I left. I heard through medical school contacts that he'd simply vanished. His office cleaned out overnight. No forwarding address, like he'd never existed at all. I kept those photographs hidden for years, moving them from one safe deposit box to another, too terrified to release them but unable to destroy the only proof I had that those women weren't imagining their nightmares. Eventually, I reached out to a journalist investigating MK Ultra projects, giving him copies of everything under the condition of anonymity, and while he published articles about government-funded LSD experiments, Clearwater Institute was never mentioned by name. It had been shuttered and demolished by then, replaced by a shopping complex as if 40 acres of pine forest had never held those buildings at all. I tracked down 3 of the women from the project through medical records and careful searching. 2 were in long-term psychiatric facilities, their minds never fully recovering from what we'd done, and the 3rd had changed her name and moved to Canada, refusing to speak with me when I finally found her number. Janet was nowhere in any system I could access, as if she'd been erased from existence completely, though sometimes I wonder if that Montreal facility stamp meant something darker than just a transfer. I finished my residency in Texas, built a small practice, tried to help people the right way, but I never stopped carrying the weight of those months at Clearwater. The camera I used to photograph those files sits in my desk drawer, the film long since developed and hidden away, a reminder of how easily medical ethics can be abandoned when someone promises you're serving a greater purpose. Whenever a patient talks about trusting their doctor completely, about putting their mental health in someone else's hands, I remember Janet's screams, the blood on that white chair, and Dr. Hoffman's gray eyes watching it all with scientific detachment. The truth is, I got away because they let me go. I was small, insignificant, just a resident who could be relocated and silenced with the right combination of threats and incentives. The real architects of that project, the ones who funded it and collected the data, they're probably still out there. Their names hidden behind classified stamps and government clearance levels I'll never have access to. I worked as an intern at Riverside State Hospital in Illinois during the spring of 2018, fresh out of my master's program and eager to make a difference in psychiatric care. At 26, I thought I understood how the system worked, the protocols, the hierarchies, the way things had to be done for everyone's safety. My supervisor, Dr. Harold Brennan, had been there for 32 years and ran the long-term ward with the efficiency of a military operation. Every morning I'd arrive at 7 sharp, badge in through 3 security checkpoints, and spend my days reviewing patient files, sitting in on group therapy sessions, and learning the careful dance of institutional psychiatry. The building itself was a relic from the 1950s, all pale green walls and narrow windows with wire mesh, the kind of place where footsteps echoed down empty corridors long after the person had passed. Among the 43 patients in our ward, one stood out to me from my first week: Robert Garrison, a 61-year-old man who'd been there for 11 years. Unlike the others who shuffled through their routines with vacant stares or muttered to invisible companions, Robert was articulate, almost desperately so. Every time I passed his room during rounds, he'd be at his small desk, writing letters to lawyers who never wrote back, filling yellow legal pads with meticulous notes about his case. His room was organized like a law office, newspaper clippings taped to the walls in chronological order, court documents filed in makeshift folders he'd fashioned from commissary paper bags, everything dated and cross-referenced. He claimed he'd been framed for his wife's murder, that someone had planted evidence and manipulated his confession, and while every patient had their story, there was something about the precision of his arguments that made me pause during those early morning rounds. It was a Thursday in May when I decided to pull Robert's court files from the archive room in the basement. Dr. Brennan was at a conference in Chicago, and I told myself I was just being thorough, learning about our patients' histories to better understand their conditions. The archive room smelled like mildew and old paper, rows of metal filing cabinets stretching back into darkness where the overhead fluorescents had burned out years ago. Robert's file was thick as a phone book, crammed with psychiatric evaluations, police reports, and trial transcripts from 2007. His wife, Catherine, had been found dead in their bathtub, drowned after being struck on the head with a ceramic lamp from their bedroom. The prosecution's case seemed solid: Robert's fingerprints on the lamp, neighbors who heard them arguing that night, and most damning, his own detailed confession given 3 days after the murder during a therapy session with Dr. Milton Cross, a specialist in recovered memory techniques who'd been brought in by the police. But as I read through the confession transcript by the light of my phone's flashlight, something strange jumped out at me. The language didn't match Robert's speaking patterns at all. The confession was full of psychiatric jargon and clinical terms that a high school math teacher wouldn't naturally use. Phrases like dissociative episode and affective dysregulation peppered the document, and the description of the murder read like something from a forensic textbook rather than a person recounting their own actions. I found the audio recording reference number at the bottom of the page and searched through the evidence boxes until I located an old cassette tape labeled R. Garrison, Session 3, May 15, 2007. My heart was pounding as I climbed back upstairs to find a player, borrowing one from the occupational therapy room, where they still use tapes for relaxation exercises. The tape was horrifying to listen to, not because of what Robert said, but because of how he said it. Dr. Cross's voice was smooth and insistent, guiding Robert through what he called a therapeutic hypnosis session to unlock suppressed memories. For the first 20 minutes, Robert sounded drowsy, almost drugged, responding to questions about his childhood, his marriage, mundane details about his daily routine. Then Cross's questioning shifted, became more directed. "You were angry that night, weren't you, Robert? Catherine had been seeing someone else. You picked up the lamp from the nightstand. You can see yourself doing it now, can't you?" And Robert's voice, flat and monotone like someone reading from a script they didn't understand, began describing the murder in that clinical language I'd found so jarring in the transcript. Every few minutes you could hear Cross saying, "That's good, Robert, go deeper now, tell me what you see." By the end of the 90-minute tape, Robert had confessed to a murder that sounded more like Cross's interpretation of events than any genuine memory. I spent the entire weekend researching Dr. Milton Cross online, and what I found made my skin prickle with unease. He'd been involved in at least 6 other cases between 2004 and 2009, where defendants had given similarly detailed confessions under hypnosis, all using that same clinical vocabulary, all later convicted based primarily on those confessions. 2 of those defendants had killed themselves in prison. One had been declared incompetent to stand trial after a mental breakdown, and the others were serving life sentences. Cross himself had disappeared from public records after 2009, though I found an obituary from 2011 saying he'd died in a car accident in Nevada. But here's what really got to me. In each case, Cross had been hired as a consultant, not by the defense or the prosecution, but by a private firm called Behavioral Solutions, Inc., which had contracts with various police departments for specialized interrogation support. The company had dissolved in 2010, just months after Cross's last documented case. Monday morning, I arrived at work an hour early, my laptop bag heavy with printed articles and copies I'd made of Robert's file at a 24-hour copy shop. I planned to present everything to Dr. Brennan, convince him we needed to contact Robert's public defender, maybe even reach out to the Innocence Project. Robert must have sensed something different about me when I stopped by his room during morning rounds, because he looked up from his writing with an expression I'd never seen before. Hope, raw and desperate. "You found something," he said. Not a question, but a statement, and I nodded slightly, whispering that I was working on it, that he needed to stay calm and give me a few days. The way his eyes filled with tears, the way he gripped his pencil so tight it snapped in half. I'll never forget that moment. I spent the rest of my shift documenting everything meticulously, creating a detailed report with timestamps from the tape, citations from Cross's other cases, and a formal recommendation for case review. But when I came in Wednesday morning, everything had changed. Robert wasn't at his desk when I passed his room. He was sitting on his bed, staring at the wall, a line of drool running down his chin. The charge nurse, Beverly, informed me that Robert had experienced an acute psychotic episode on Monday night, becoming violent and attacking an orderly, though she seemed confused when I asked for details about which orderly and what exactly had happened. Dr. Brennan had authorized an emergency procedure, a transorbital lobotomy, performed Tuesday afternoon by a visiting surgeon whose name wasn't in any of our staff directories. When I frantically searched for my report in the hospital's digital system, it was gone, not even in the deletion records. My key card no longer opened the archive room, and when I tried to log into my account from home that evening, my credentials had been revoked. Dr. Brennan left me a voicemail saying my internship was being terminated due to breach of patient confidentiality protocols, and that I should return my badge by Friday. I couldn't just walk away. Thursday night, I convinced Jamal, an orderly who'd always been friendly with me, to meet me at a diner off Route 47. He was nervous, kept checking the parking lot through the window, but after 3 cups of coffee and my promise that I'd never mention his name, he told me what he knew. There had been no violent episode Monday night. Robert had been sedated right after dinner, taken directly to the medical wing. Jamal had seen 2 men in suits wheeling Robert's gurney, men he'd never seen before who had visitor badges but somehow had keys to the restricted areas. More disturbing, Jamal mentioned that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Over his 8 years at Riverside, he'd seen at least 4 other patients who'd been trying to appeal their cases suddenly have episodes requiring immediate surgical intervention. Always when Dr. Brennan was conveniently away or occupied, always with visiting surgeons who vanished afterward, always with paperwork that somehow got filed incorrectly or lost entirely. The next morning, I drove back to the hospital one last time, not to return my badge, but to see Robert. Security tried to stop me, but I told them I'd left personal items in my desk and had Dr. Brennan's permission, a lie that bought me maybe 10 minutes. I found Robert in the day room, sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his eyes vacant and unfocused. The precise, articulate man who'd fought for 11 years to prove his innocence was gone. When I knelt beside him and said his name, he turned toward me slowly, a bit of recognition flickering somewhere deep behind his eyes. "Catherine," he whispered, and then nothing more. On my way out, I passed Dr. Brennan in the hallway, and he stopped me with a hand on my shoulder, his grip just a bit too firm. "Some patients," he said quietly, "are here because the system knows exactly where they belong. It's unfortunate when young idealists don't understand the bigger picture. I trust you'll be discreet about your time here, for your own career's sake." I spent weeks trying to find someone who would listen. Legal aid organizations, journalism departments at universities, even the ACLU. But without the original documents, without access to Robert's files, I had nothing but my word against a respected state institution. The cassette tape I'd listened to supposedly never existed, according to official records. The copy shop where I'd made duplicates had a convenient fire in their storage room 2 days after my visit, destroying their security footage and machine records. 3 months later, I received a letter from the state licensing board saying they'd received a complaint about my unprofessional conduct during my internship, and that any attempt to pursue psychiatric credentials would be subject to extensive review. I took a job in medical billing, as far from patient care as I could get, but I kept every note I'd made, every screenshot I'd managed to take before my access was revoked. Everything stored in multiple cloud accounts under different names. Last month, 5 years after that nightmare at Riverside, I got an unexpected email from Jamal. Robert had died of pneumonia in the hospital ward, forgotten and silent to the end. But Jamal had something else to tell me. Beverly, the charge nurse, was retiring and had been cleaning out old files from her personal cabinet. She'd found something wedged behind a drawer, something that must have fallen back there years ago. A partial photocopy of Dr. Cross's original session notes with Robert, handwritten observations that never made it into the official transcript. In the margins, Cross had written, "Subject resistant to suggestion, increased sodium pentothal dosage. Narrative implanted successfully after 3rd attempt. Client satisfied with results." Below that, a phone number with a note. "Contact H. Brennan for remaining payment." Beverly was scared, didn't want trouble, but she'd given the paper to Jamal before destroying it. He sent me a photo before burning it himself, too afraid to keep evidence. I still have that photo, encrypted and hidden. The only proof that Robert Garrison spent 11 years in a psychiatric hospital for a murder someone else committed, lobotomized not for violence, but for refusing to stop proclaiming his innocence. Sometimes I wonder how many others are sitting in institutions right now, their truths dissolved by chemicals and scalpels, their stories buried in basement archives that no one will ever search. I never thought I'd be writing about Kyle here, But after what the police showed me last week, I need to get this out there. Maybe someone can make sense of it, because I sure can't. Kyle Brenner was my roommate for 2 years while we both attended film school in Boston. He dropped out in 2022 to focus on his YouTube channel, paranormal investigations, urban exploration, that kind of content. The guy was obsessed with abandoned places, especially ones with dark histories. He'd spend hours researching locations, digging through old newspaper archives, tracking down former employees or patients. His channel had around 40,000 subscribers. Nothing huge, but enough that he was making decent money from sponsors and memberships. That night in early December, he told me he'd found the perfect location for his biggest live stream yet, some abandoned psychiatric hospital about 3 hours north of the city. The place was called Whitmore State Hospital, and Kyle had been researching it for months. Over dinner that week, he couldn't stop talking about what he'd uncovered. The hospital operated from 1923 to 1986, but what made it notorious were the experimental procedures they performed in the 1940s. Apparently, some doctor named Clarence Whitmore, yeah, they named it after him, had been performing lobotomies before they were even officially approved. But these weren't just regular lobotomies. Kyle showed me these photocopies of old medical journals where other doctors had criticized Whitmore's techniques as unnecessarily invasive and ethically questionable, which in 1940s medical speak probably meant absolutely horrifying. The state shut down that whole wing in 1947 after several patients died, but the hospital kept operating for another 40 years. Kyle had this whole folder of documentation, including building blueprints he'd somehow gotten from a contact at the county records office. The night of December 8th, Kyle set up his streaming equipment in our living room for a final check before heading out. He had 2 cameras, his main DSLR and a backup GoPro strapped to his chest, plus 3 different flashlights, backup batteries, and his phone as a mobile hotspot for the stream. I remember him adjusting the settings on his laptop, making sure the stream quality would hold up even with a weak signal. He'd promoted this live stream for weeks on his channel, calling it the Whitmore Investigation, live and unfiltered. By the time he went live at 9 p.m., there were already about 3,000 people waiting in the chat. I watched the first few minutes from my room. Kyle was in his car, driving through this thick fog, explaining the history of the place to his viewers. He mentioned that the surgical wing where Whitmore did his experiments had been sealed since 1947, but he'd found a maintenance tunnel that might lead inside. The chat was going crazy with excitement, people sending donations, asking him to check specific rooms. I actually fell asleep around 10:30 that night, while Kyle was still streaming. From what I've pieced together from the archived footage and chat logs the police showed me, he reached the hospital around 10:15. The building looked exactly like you'd expect. Broken windows, graffiti everywhere, vines crawling up the brick walls. Kyle spent about 20 minutes just walking around the outside, showing his viewers the different wings, reading old signs that were barely visible in the darkness. The main entrance had been boarded up, but he found a side door that had been pried open, probably by other urban explorers or vandals. The first floor was mostly administrative offices, nothing too interesting except for some old patient files scattered around that he didn't touch, saying something about respecting privacy even decades later. It was when he found the stairwell to the basement that things started getting weird. The chat logs show that around 11 p.m., viewers started commenting that they were hearing something in the background of his audio, like a low humming or droning sound that Kyle apparently couldn't hear through his earbuds. The basement was where the old surgical wing connected to the main building. Kyle's flashlight kept catching these long shadows down the corridors, and the walls were lined with those old mint green tiles that hospitals used back then, most of them cracked or fallen off completely. According to the stream footage, he spent about 15 minutes navigating through what looked like a maze of hallways, following his blueprint by the light of his phone screen. The chat was getting more and more agitated. People kept saying they were seeing something moving in the peripheral edges of his camera frame, always just out of direct view. One user, Brooklyn Ghost 22, typed in all caps that there was definitely someone else down there with him. Kyle either wasn't reading the chat or was ignoring it for dramatic effect. He kept narrating what he was seeing. Old gurneys pushed against walls, rooms with rusted bed frames, a nurse's station with medication logs still sitting on the desk from 1986. Then he found it, a heavy metal door with Surgical Suite B stamped on a brass plate. The door had been chained shut, but the chain was old and rusted. Kyle pulled out a crowbar from his backpack. The timestamp on the video shows 11:47 p.m. when Kyle finally got the chain off. The door scraped against the floor as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through his microphone and making several viewers comment that it sounded like screaming. Inside, the surgical room was bizarrely well preserved. There was this operating table in the center, still with its leather straps hanging down, and cabinets along the walls filled with old medical instruments. Kyle panned his camera slowly across the room, and that's when it happened, when everyone saw it. In the corner behind a tall medical cabinet with glass doors, there was clear movement. Not like a shadow or a trick of the light, but something solid ducking out of view. The chat exploded. People were typing, "Get out," and behind the cabinet so fast the messages were just a blur on the screen. Kyle walked closer to investigate, saying something about it probably being a raccoon or another explorer. His camera was focused on the cabinet when viewers started screaming in the chat about his chest cam footage. The GoPro was picking up something his main camera wasn't. In that footage, which the police enhanced and showed me, you can see what looks like fingers gripping the edge of another cabinet about 10 feet to Kyle's left, like someone was peering around it. Kyle never saw those fingers. He was completely focused on the first cabinet, pulling it away from the wall to check behind it. When he did, there was nothing there except old water damage and peeling paint. But the chat was going absolutely insane. The viewer count had jumped to almost 8,000 people, and donations were pouring in with messages begging him to leave immediately. Someone donated $50 with the message, "Please just run now." Kyle finally glanced at his phone to check the chat, and you could see him pause, probably reading all the warnings. He laughed more, and said something like, "Come on guys, you're letting your imagination get the best of you. It's just an old building." That's when he decided to explore the adjoining room through a doorway on the far side of the surgical suite. The doorway led to what looked like a prep room, with old sinks and metal tables. As he walked through, his main camera started getting this weird interference. These horizontal lines rolling up the screen every few seconds. Kyle blamed it on the old electrical wiring possibly still having some residual charge, which made no sense, but he kept going. The prep room connected to a narrow hallway with 3 doors. Kyle tried the first 2, both locked solid, wouldn't budge even with his crowbar. The third door was slightly ajar. The timestamp shows 12:14 a.m. when he pushed it open. Inside was what Kyle identified as Whitmore's personal office, based on a nameplate still sitting on the desk. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets along one wall. There were papers everywhere, like someone had dumped out all the files decades ago. Kyle set his main camera on the desk to get a wide shot while he looked through some of the papers with his flashlight. That's when the stream started getting really strange. The viewers could see Kyle examining documents, but behind him, in the doorway he'd just come through, there was a shadow that didn't match anything in the room. The shadow would appear for a few seconds, then disappear, then reappear slightly closer. One viewer managed to screenshot it and enhance the image. They said it looked like someone in old medical scrubs standing perfectly still. But here's the truly disturbing part. Kyle's voice started echoing. Not like a normal echo in an empty room, but his words from earlier in the stream were repeating faintly in the background. Viewers could hear him saying, "Just an old building," over and over, getting slightly louder each time. At 12:31 a.m., Kyle picked up his camera from the desk and turned around to leave the office. The doorway was empty, nothing blocking his path. But when he stepped into the hallway, his flashlight died, just went completely black. The camera's night vision kicked in, showing everything in that greenish-gray tint, and that's when viewers saw what Kyle couldn't see in the darkness. There were people in the hallway. Not one person, but 3 or 4 figures standing completely motionless at different points along the corridor. They were all facing the walls, their heads pressed against them like children being punished. Kyle pulled out his backup flashlight, and the second the beam hit the hallway, the figures were gone. Not like they ran away. The video shows they just weren't there anymore the instant the light touched where they'd been standing. Kyle muttered something about the night vision playing tricks, but his voice was shaking now. He started walking faster, trying to retrace his steps back to the surgical suite. The chat was in complete chaos. People were begging him to call the police, to get out any way he could. The viewer count had hit 12,000. Someone kept spamming "they're following you" over and over. Kyle made it back to the surgical suite, but something was wrong with the room. In the stream footage, viewers could see that all the medical instruments in the cabinets had been rearranged. What had been random placement before was now organized into perfect rows, all the sharp edges pointing outward toward the center of the room. Kyle didn't notice or didn't comment on it. He was focused on getting back to the basement corridor. But as he crossed the room, his GoPro picked up audio that the main camera missed. It was breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing that seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. The enhanced audio the police played for me was even worse. Underneath the breathing, you could hear what sounded like metal scraping against tile, like something being dragged. Kyle reached the door to the main basement corridor at 12:43 a.m. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't open. Not locked. The handle turned fine, but it was like something was holding it shut from the other side. Kyle put the camera down and used both hands, really yanking on it. The chat feed shows viewers screaming at him to look behind him. In his camera view, that operating table in the center of the room. Its leather straps were now standing straight up, defying gravity, reaching toward the ceiling like fingers. That's when the stream started cutting out. The video would freeze for a second, go to static, then come back. Each time it returned, Kyle seemed to be in a slightly different position in the room, like frames were missing. In one return, he was at the door. Next, he was back by the operating table, then by the cabinets. He didn't seem aware of these jumps. He kept talking as if nothing was happening, still trying to get the door open. But his words weren't matching his mouth movements anymore. The audio was delayed, or maybe it was from earlier, viewers couldn't tell. At 12:51 a.m., the stream stabilized for about 30 seconds. Kyle had given up on the door and was trying to smash through the glass of one of the windows high up on the wall. He'd stacked 2 gurneys and was standing on them, hitting the glass with his crowbar. The chat shows multiple people pointing out that his shadow on the wall had too many arms. The enhanced footage confirms it. His shadow showed 4 arms instead of 2, with the extra ones hanging limp at wrong angles. Then viewers heard Kyle's voice, clear as day, saying, "Don't turn off the light. Don't turn off the light." But his mouth wasn't moving. He was still smashing at the window, completely silent except for the impact sounds, while his voice repeated that phrase over and over from somewhere else in the room. At exactly 1 a.m., everything went white. Not static, not black, pure white. The stream stayed that way for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The chat was still active, thousands of people typing, asking what happened, begging for Kyle to respond. Then, at 1:04:17 a.m., the video came back for exactly 3 seconds. It showed Kyle's face in extreme close-up, like he was holding the camera right against his chin. His eyes were wide open, but looking at something above the camera, not at the lens. His mouth was moving rapidly like he was speaking incredibly fast, but the only audio was that same phrase, "Don't turn off the light." The stream ended there, just cut to nothing. The chat stayed active for hours, people trying to figure out what they'd just witnessed. Someone called the Boston Police Department around 2 a.m. They said they couldn't do anything since Kyle was streaming from New Hampshire. so they contacted state police up there. It took them 3 days to find the hospital. Kyle had been careful not to reveal the exact location during his stream, to avoid getting in trouble for trespassing. When the police finally got to Whitmore State Hospital on December 11th, they found Kyle's car still parked outside, covered in frost. His streaming equipment was discovered in that same surgical suite, the camera still recording somehow, despite the battery supposedly only lasting 4 hours max. The memory card had 43 hours of footage on it. Impossible, since the card could only hold 16 hours. Most of it was just the empty room, but every few hours, you could hear Kyle's voice faintly saying that same phrase about the light. The really disturbing part was what they found when they checked the timestamp data. According to the camera's internal clock, it had been recording continuously since December 8th, but it showed dates jumping randomly, sometimes showing December 2022, sometimes March 1947, sometimes dates that hadn't happened yet. The police tech guy said it was probably a malfunction, but he'd never seen anything like it. They found Kyle's phone in the basement corridor, the screen cracked, but still functional. His streaming app was still open, showing 0 viewers and a stream duration of -17 hours, whatever that means. His backpack was in Whitmore's office, everything neatly arranged inside like he'd carefully packed it to leave. But Kyle himself was nowhere in the building. Here's where it gets worse and why I'm writing this. 5 days after they found his equipment, Kyle walked into a gas station in Concord, about 60 miles from the hospital. The security footage shows him entering at 3:47 a.m., walking straight to the counter, and asking the clerk to call someone for him. The clerk said Kyle couldn't remember his own phone number, couldn't remember how he'd gotten there, but kept insisting someone needed to turn the light back on at the hospital. The police picked him up, and he's been in psychiatric care since then. I visited him twice. The first time, he didn't recognize me at all, just kept drawing these detailed floor plans of the hospital on any paper he could find. The second time, last week, he grabbed my arm and said my name for the first time since they found him. He told me he remembered everything from that night, that he'd found more than just abandoned rooms in that basement. He said there were people still there, still working, still performing procedures. Not ghosts or whatever. Actual people who'd never left when the hospital closed. He said they've been living in sections of the building that aren't on any blueprint, spaces between the walls, continuing Whitmore's work. The doctors think it's trauma-induced psychosis. But Kyle gave me coordinates, specific measurements of where these hidden spaces are. I haven't told anyone else this, but I drove up there yesterday just to look from outside. The building's been completely demolished. Nothing left but an empty lot. The demolition order was dated December 7th, the day before Kyle's stream. The company that did it has no record of the job. The old Greystone State Hospital had been shuttered since 1987, but in March of 2016, I managed to get permission to spend 3 nights there for a documentary I was putting together about psychiatric institutions in the 1950s. At that point in my life, freelancing was barely paying my rent in Portland, and my apartment was basically a storage unit for old medical journals and declassified government documents. I'd been chasing stories like this since my 20s, and now, more than a decade into this career, I'd learned that the darker the history, the more people wanted to watch. I'd spent 6 months researching Greystone specifically because of the electroshock experiments they'd conducted there. Dr. Edmund Farrow had run a program that supposedly helped schizophrenic patients through intensive electrical therapy sessions, though most of his records had mysteriously disappeared after a patient named Dorothy Vance died under questionable circumstances in 1958. I arrived at Greystone on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 duffel bags full of recording equipment, 5 digital voice recorders, a camcorder, extra batteries, and enough protein bars to last me through the weekend. The building looked exactly like you'd expect an abandoned asylum to look, all peeling paint and broken windows, except for the electroshock ward on the 2nd floor, which had been preserved almost perfectly. Room 213 was where they'd done the actual procedures, and walking in there felt like stepping into a photograph from 60 years ago. The leather restraint chair was still bolted to the floor, the electrical panels still had their original dials and switches, and there was this observation window that looked in from the hallway, though someone had sealed it with industrial-grade adhesive at some point. My plan was simple enough: set up the recorders in different spots around the ward, let them run overnight and hopefully capture some ambient sound that would add atmosphere to the documentary. I placed one recorder on the metal tray table next to the restraint chair, another on the windowsill overlooking the courtyard, a third in the hallway just outside room 213, and the fourth near the old nurse's station. The fifth one I kept with me as backup. While I was setting everything up, I noticed something odd about the observation room behind that sealed window. There were scratch marks on the inside of the glass, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. The adhesive was yellowed with age but still solid, and according to the maintenance logs I'd found, that room had been sealed in 1959, right after Dorothy Vance's death. That first night I slept in what used to be the doctor's lounge down the hall, far enough from the electroshock ward that I wouldn't hear every little creak and groan of the old building. Around 2 a.m. I woke up because I thought I heard footsteps above me, but the third floor had collapsed years ago. There was literally nothing up there but exposed beams and pigeons. I checked my phone and saw that the recorders were still running, their little red lights blinking in the darkness when I peeked down the hallway. The building had this particular smell, like wet newspaper mixed with something medicinal that had soaked into the walls over decades. I went back to sleep telling myself that abandoned buildings make all kinds of noises, especially ones with this much history bleeding through the cracks. The next morning, I went to collect the recorders, eager to see if I'd captured anything useful. The first three were exactly where I'd left them, but when I got to the nurse's station, that recorder was on the floor, not on the desk where I'd placed it. The device was still recording, and when I picked it up, I noticed the battery was almost dead, even though I'd put in fresh ones the night before. I gathered all four devices and sat in the lounge with my laptop, transferring the audio files. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: settling wood, wind through broken windows, maybe some rats in the walls. But when I got to the recording from the device in room 213, the one on the metal tray table, I heard something that made me stop the playback and rewind. At 3:47 a.m., there was a woman's voice barely above a whisper reciting names: Dorothy Vance, Franklin Hewitt, Margaret Russo, Anthony Carmine. I recognized some of these from my research. They were all patients who'd undergone Dr. Farrow's experimental treatments between 1954 and 1958. The voice continued for about 2 minutes, listing maybe 15 or 16 names total. And then, at the very end, clear as day, she said my name: Brian Novak. The thing is, I'd never published under my real name, always used pseudonyms for my articles, and I definitely hadn't mentioned it to anyone at Greystone or even to the caretaker who'd let me in. The voice had this quality to it, like someone speaking through water or from very far away, but the names were unmistakably clear, especially mine. I played it back 3 more times, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe someone was playing a prank, but who would know those specific patient names? The historical records I'd found were scattered across different archives, some only available through Freedom of Information Act requests. I checked the other recordings from that same time frame, and they all had the usual ambient noise, except for one detail. On the hallway recorder, about 5 minutes before the voice started listing names, there was the sound of a door opening. Not creaking or being forced, but opening normally, like someone with a key. The nurse's station recording, the one from the device I'd found on the floor, had captured something else entirely: rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on metal, that went on for nearly an hour, starting at exactly 3:42 a.m. I spent the rest of that day going through the hospital's old employee records that I'd photocopied from the state archives. There was no mention of any female staff member who'd worked closely with Dr. Farrow during those experiments, Just 2 male orderlies and a male nurse named Christopher Dalton. But in the margins of one report from 1958, someone had penciled in a note. Mrs. F knows about the recordings in 213. Mrs. F. Could that have been Pharaoh's wife? I searched for any mention of her in the documents but found nothing. The daylight was starting to fade, and I had to decide whether to pack up and leave or stay for the second night. I'd driven 4 hours to get here, had permission for 3 nights, and honestly, I needed this footage for my documentary. Against every instinct telling me to get out, I decided to stay and set up the recorders again, this time adding my backup 5th recorder inside room 213, right on the seat of the restraint chair. That second night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat in the doctor's lounge with my laptop, reviewing more of the audio from the first night and cross-referencing patient names with the hospital's admission records. Around 1 a.m., I heard actual footsteps in the hallway, not above me this time, but on the same floor, moving slowly toward the electroshock ward. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check, but the hallway was empty. The recorders were still in place, their red lights creating tiny dots in the darkness. When I shined my light into room 213, the 5th recorder, the one I'd placed on the restraint chair, was now on the floor, face down. I know I'd secured it with gaffer tape because I didn't want it falling off during the night. The tape was still on the chair, torn cleanly down the middle like someone had pulled the device straight through it. I picked up the recorder and checked it. Still running, but the display showed it had been recording for 7 hours, which was impossible since I'd only set it up 2 hours ago. The timestamp on the device had somehow jumped backward to the previous night. I was trying to make sense of this when I heard something that made me drop the recorder, a woman humming from inside the sealed observation room. Not a recording, not an echo, but actual humming coming from behind that adhesive-covered window. I put my ear against the sealed glass and could hear it more clearly. A lullaby. Something familiar but wrong, like the notes were slightly off-key. Then the humming stopped, and I heard breathing slow and deliberate, as if someone had their mouth pressed against the other side of the glass, exactly where my ear was. I jerked away from the window and ran back to the lounge, grabbing my equipment. I wasn't staying another minute in that place. As I threw everything into my bags, I realized one of the recorders was missing. The one from the metal tray table in room 213, the same one that had captured the woman's voice listing names the night before. I knew I should just leave it, but those devices cost $300 each, and I needed it. I went back to room 213 one last time, using my phone's flashlight since I'd already packed my good one. The recorder wasn't on the tray table, wasn't on the floor, wasn't anywhere in the room. But when I turned to leave, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The adhesive seal on the observation window had been peeled back at one corner, just enough for someone to squeeze their fingers through. Fresh adhesive was dripping down the wall like honey. The next morning, after driving straight home without stopping, I got a call from the caretaker at Greystone. He said the state police had been called to the hospital because someone had broken into the sealed observation room. They'd found my missing recorder inside, along with my fingerprints on the interior walls and door handle. The thing is, that room had been sealed since 1959, and when they checked their records, they found that it had been sealed from the inside, not the outside. The caretaker said they also found something else in there, a box of old recordings, reel-to-reel tapes from the 1950s, each one labeled with a patient name. The last tape in the box had my name on it, written in pencil, and when they played it, it was 47 minutes of my own voice describing electroshock procedures I'd never researched, using medical terminology I didn't know, speaking as if I was Dr. Pharaoh himself, conducting a session on a patient named Brian Novak. The police wanted me to come in for questioning, but what could I tell them? That I'd never been inside that room. The fingerprint evidence said otherwise. My lawyer advised me to claim someone had lifted my prints and planted them, but even she didn't believe that explanation. The investigation went on for months, and during that time, I did my own research into Dr. Pharaoh's wife. Turns out her name was Frances, and she'd been a patient at Greystone before marrying Edmund Farrow in 1952. She'd been admitted for hysteria and auditory hallucinations. She claimed she could hear the thoughts of people who hadn't been born yet. The staff notes described her as unusually fixated on recording devices, and mentioned that she would spend hours talking into empty rooms, claiming she was leaving messages for the documentary maker. Frances Farrow died in 1959, the same year they sealed the observation room, apparently from a self-inflicted electrical burn sustained while trying to operate her husband's equipment alone. I never finished the documentary. The footage I shot at Greystone sits in a box in my closet, unwatched since that night. Sometimes I wonder if I should destroy it all, but I can't bring myself to do it. Last month I got a package with no return address. Inside was one of my recorders, the one the police said they'd kept as evidence. It had a recording on it dated from next year, April 2017, and it's my voice again, except I'm 70 years old in it, describing my treatment at Greystone and thanking Dr. Farrow for curing my temporal displacement disorder. The recording is 3 hours long, and at the end, I can hear that same woman's voice from the first night, except now I recognize it. It's Frances Farrow, and she's saying, "Session complete. Patient Brian Novak, admitted March 2016, discharged April 1959. Riverside Memorial's West Wing had broken air conditioning that late summer of 2015, making 12-hour shifts feel like an eternity in that psychiatric unit. After 11 years as a nurse there, most cases blurred together, but Natalie Foster stood out from the moment her husband Tom brought her through those doors. She was 34, had designed award-winning buildings before her breakdown, and Tom found her sitting in their bathtub, fully clothed, insisting she needed to practice being in a coffin. The intake paperwork listed severe dissociative disorder with depersonalization, but those clinical terms didn't capture the absolute conviction in her eyes when she told me during that first assessment that she had died in a car accident 3 years prior and was just a ghost pretending to be alive. She spoke about it so matter-of-factly, like explaining that the sky was blue or water was wet, and even showed me newspaper clippings she carried in her purse about various car accidents, pointing to random victims and claiming those were about her death. Dr. Warren Steinberg had been treating Natalie for 2 months when he proposed the exposure therapy that would change everything. That staff meeting still haunts me. The fluorescent lights humming overhead, the bitter taste of break room coffee, and the way my supervisor Karen kept clicking her pen nervously as Steinberg outlined his plan. He wanted to take Natalie down to the hospital morgue, let her see actual deceased bodies, force her to confront the difference between death and her current state. The theory sounded almost reasonable when he explained it with his charts and studies, talking about radical exposure therapy and breakthrough cases from some research hospital in Phoenix. But something in my gut twisted hard when he mentioned she'd need to spend extended periods there, not just minutes but hours at a time, 3 sessions per week minimum. Karen asked about ethics approval, and Steinberg produced a thick folder of paperwork, signatures from the board, consent forms that Tom had signed with tears streaming down his face, desperate to get his wife back to who she used to be. The first session happened on a Monday morning, and they assigned me to accompany them since Natalie trusted me more than the other nurses. The morgue was in the basement, past the loading docks where they brought supplies, down a long hallway with pipes running along the ceiling that dripped condensation onto the cracked linoleum floor. Dr. Coleman, the chief medical examiner, met us at the entrance wearing that perpetual frown he always had, clearly uncomfortable with the whole arrangement but bound by whatever agreement Steinberg had made with administration. Natalie walked between us like she was heading to a regular therapy appointment, even humming softly under her breath, some melody that sounded like a lullaby played backward. When Coleman opened the heavy metal door and that wave of cold, preservative-scented air hit us, Natalie actually smiled and said it felt like coming home. The room had 8 steel tables, 3 occupied by bodies covered in white sheets, and the fluorescent lights gave everything this bluish tinge that made even us living people look somewhat corpse-like. Steinberg instructed Natalie to sit in a chair he'd placed between two of the occupied tables, close enough that she could reach out and touch the sheets if she wanted. The first hour, she just sat there perfectly still, barely blinking while Steinberg took notes on his clipboard and asked her questions about what she was experiencing. She answered in this dreamy, disconnected voice, describing how familiar everything felt, how the bodies under the sheets were just like her, caught between worlds, pretending to be something they weren't. Around the 90-minute mark, she started having conversations with the covered corpses, not in a crazy, yelling way, but quiet, intimate whispers like she was sharing secrets with old friends. Steinberg seemed thrilled, scribbling faster in his notebook, muttering about breakthrough responses and cognitive dissonance markers. But watching Natalie lean toward that sheet-covered form, whispering earnestly to whoever she thought was listening underneath, made my stomach churn in a way that had nothing to do with the preserved flesh smell permeating that room. By the third week, Natalie had stopped eating regular meals, claiming dead people didn't need food, only surviving on the protein shakes Tom forced her to drink during his visits. The sessions had extended to 3 hours each, and Steinberg had gotten permission to leave her alone in the morgue for portions of that time, observing through a security camera while he reviewed notes upstairs. During one session in early September, while I waited outside the morgue doors on my break, I heard Natalie through the ventilation grate, not talking this time, but making these wet, rhythmic sounds like someone learning to breathe underwater. When I rushed inside, I found her pressing her face against one of the body bags that had arrived that morning, inhaling deeply through the plastic. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She told Steinberg later that she was trying to remember what death smelled like, trying to match her own scent to theirs. And he actually wrote this down like it was some kind of therapeutic breakthrough instead of a woman literally huffing corpse fumes through plastic. The changes in Natalie accelerated after that incident, transforming her from a confused but functional person into something else entirely. Her skin took on this grayish pallor that wasn't quite medical, but wasn't quite right either, and she started moving differently. These slow, deliberate gestures like she was underwater or operating her body by remote control. Tom stopped visiting after she told him he was talking to an echo, that the real Natalie was downstairs in drawer number 7, waiting to be properly buried. The other patients in the ward started avoiding her, claiming she smelled like formaldehyde even though she showered twice daily, scrubbing her skin until it was raw and bleeding in places. But Steinberg kept pushing forward with his sessions, now up to 4 hours at a time, bringing in fresh corpses for her to sit with, documenting her reactions as she traced her fingers along their cold faces, whispering questions none of us could quite make out, but that seemed to get answers only she could hear. The night everything fell apart started with a call from Coleman around 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in late September. Security had found the morgue door propped open with a wheelchair, and when they checked inside, they discovered Natalie had somehow gotten out of the locked ward and made her way down there alone. They found her lying on one of the empty steel tables, arms crossed over her chest, not breathing, or rather taking breaths so shallow that the security guard initially thought she was actually dead. When they tried to move her, she went rigid, every muscle locked in place like rigor mortis had set in, and it took 4 of us plus 2 orderlies to get her onto a gurney. The strangest part was her temperature, 76 degrees Fahrenheit when we finally got a reading, cold enough that she should have been in severe hypothermia, but her heart was still beating steady at 40 beats per minute. Steinberg arrived within the hour, furious about the security breach but fascinated by her condition, ordering warming blankets while simultaneously documenting what he called a death state achievement in his notes. For the next 2 days, Natalie remained in that state, cold, rigid, barely breathing but somehow still alive. She wouldn't respond to anyone, not even pain stimuli, just lay there with her eyes open but unfocused, pupils dilated so wide her brown irises looked black. Then on Friday afternoon, she suddenly sat up, turned to look directly at the empty space beside her bed. and started having a full conversation with someone who wasn't there. Not the confused rambling of psychosis, but actual back-and-forth dialogue, pausing to listen, nodding at responses, even laughing at something her invisible companion apparently said. She talked about the morgue like it was a waiting room, described the bodies as travelers preparing for a journey, and mentioned that the woman in drawer 7, the one she'd claimed was the real Natalie, had been teaching her things. When Karen asked what kinds of things, Natalie just smiled this serene, empty smile and said we wouldn't understand because we were still pretending to be alive, still playing the game of warmth and breath and heartbeat. After that incident, the hospital administration finally stepped in and terminated Steinberg's experimental treatment. But the damage was already done. Natalie had gone completely silent by early November, wouldn't speak to anyone. Not the new psychiatrist they brought in, not the nurses, not even Tom when he tried one last visit before filing for divorce. She would just sit in her room, positioned in the exact same spot every day, facing the corner where the walls met, moving her lips constantly like she was having conversations we couldn't hear. The new doctor, a woman named Dr. Lisa Thornton from Johns Hopkins, tried everything: antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, even electroconvulsive therapy with the family's consent. But nothing brought Natalie back from wherever she'd gone. The only time she showed any awareness of her surroundings was when they had to wheel her past the basement level in the elevator for medical tests. She would press her hands against the elevator walls and lean toward the doors, her whole body straining toward the morgue like a plant bending toward sunlight. 6 months later, in May of 2016, the call came during my morning shift. The night nurse, a new hire named Dennis who didn't know Natalie's full history, had found her missing from her room at the 4 a.m. check. Security footage showed her walking calmly out of the ward at 3:17 a.m. Somehow the door that was supposed to be locked had been left open by a maintenance worker fixing the air conditioning. They found her in the morgue, of course, sitting on the floor beside gurney number 7, the one she'd always claimed held the real Natalie. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. She wasn't alone down there. Or at least she was having a complete two-sided conversation with someone. And when they reviewed the security footage later, they could see her clearly responding to something, looking at a specific spot next to her, even reaching out to touch something that wasn't there. The audio picked up her side of the conversation perfectly, talking about finally being ready, about understanding what comes next, about how the waiting was over. When they tried to get Natalie to stand up and leave the morgue, she went into that rigid state again, but this time it was different. Her body temperature read 68 degrees, and her pulse was barely detectable, maybe 20 beats per minute. Dr. Thornton made the decision to let her stay there while they monitored her vitals, thinking that forcing her to leave might cause complete cardiac arrest. For 3 hours, Natalie sat beside that empty gurney, occasionally nodding, sometimes smiling, her lips moving in constant conversation with whoever she believed was there. Then at 7:23 a.m. she suddenly stood up, walked to the middle of the room, and announced in a clear, strong voice, the first word she'd spoken in months, that she understood now, that the woman in drawer 7 had explained everything, that dying wasn't about stopping but about transitioning, and that she'd been doing it wrong by trying to force it. She said she needed to wait for her appointment, that everyone had one, and hers was coming soon. Before anyone could respond, she walked calmly back to the psychiatric ward with us, allowed herself to be admitted to her room, and sat in her usual corner spot, returning to her silent state. That was 8 years ago, and Natalie is still there in that same ward, in that same corner, having those same silent conversations with someone only she can see. She's become something of a legend among the staff, the patient who spent so much time with the dead that she forgot how to be alive. New nurses always ask about her, especially when they notice how she never seems to age quite right, how her skin maintains that slightly gray pallor no matter how much sunlight she gets during outdoor therapy, how her body temperature never quite reaches normal. Dr. Thornton left after 2 years, said she couldn't explain what happened to Natalie medically or psychiatrically. Steinberg lost his license after an investigation revealed he'd falsified some of his research data, though he still writes papers about Natalie's case from his retirement in Florida. And me? I transferred to pediatric care after that last incident. Couldn't handle walking past that basement entrance every day, knowing what happened down there. But sometimes when I work night shifts and pass by the psychiatric ward, I wonder if Natalie is still sitting in that corner, still whispering to her invisible companion, still waiting for that appointment she mentioned. And what exactly will happen when it finally arrives? That summer of 1982 changed everything about how I see psychiatric care. Pinewood Behavioral Center sat in rural Pennsylvania, 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless cornfields and gravel roads that turned into thick mud whenever storm clouds rolled through. I'd been working there for about 3 months as a nurse. At 23, it was my first real job after finishing school. Most of the staff lived on site in converted dormitories from when the building served as a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 40s. The isolation wing where I worked had 12 padded rooms, though we rarely used more than 3 or 4 at a time. My supervisor, a woman named Judith with steel gray hair and a perpetual coffee stain on her scrubs, told me during my first week that the isolation rooms were a last resort, only for patients who posed immediate danger to themselves or others. I believed her then, trusted the system, trusted that everything we did was for the patient's benefit. The patient they called Jimmy, though his real name was James Whitfield, had been with us for 6 months when everything went wrong. He was 31, diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder, and had these episodes where he'd pace the halls for hours muttering numbers in sequences that never repeated. He wasn't violent, just confused most days, always asking about his sister who died in a car accident 5 years before his admission. On that Friday afternoon in August, Jimmy had gotten agitated during group therapy when another patient started screaming about seeing bugs crawling under his skin. The charge nurse, a guy named Carl who always smelled like menthol cigarettes and had worked there since the 60s, decided Jimmy needed time in isolation to calm down. I remember thinking it was excessive. Jimmy was just scared, covering his ears and rocking in his chair. But Carl outranked me, and questioning senior staff wasn't something a new nurse did if she wanted to keep her job. The storm hit around 7 that evening, just as I was helping Carl escort Jimmy to room 9 in the isolation wing. The hallway lights flickered while we walked, and Jimmy kept stopping every few steps, pressing his palms flat against the walls like he was trying to feel for vibrations. "The numbers are wrong today," he kept saying, his voice barely above a whisper. 7, 14, 21, but then it skips to 23. Why does it skip? Carl just grabbed his arm harder, practically dragging him the last few feet. Room 9 had padding that went up 8 feet on every wall, yellowed foam that had absorbed decades of sweat and fear and God knows what else. The observation window in the door was reinforced with wire mesh, and there was a single overhead light protected by a metal cage. Protocol said we had to remove Jimmy's shoes, belt, and anything else he could use to hurt himself. He cooperated, even folded his clothes neatly and handed them to me. But his eyes never left that caged light fixture. By 8:30, the storm had knocked out half the county's power grid, and our backup generators kicked in with a grinding mechanical wheeze that echoed through the whole building. I was doing rounds in the main ward when the lights went completely dark for about 10 seconds. Not just dim, but absolute blackness that made you lose all sense of where you were standing. When the emergency power finally stabilized, only about half the lights came back on, casting these long, distorted shadows down every corridor. The administrator, Mr. Donovan, called an emergency meeting in the cafeteria. He had this thin mustache he was always touching when he got nervous, and that night, he couldn't stop fidgeting with it. "We're running on limited power until morning," he announced to the skeleton crew of maybe 15 staff members. "Priority goes to the medical wing, the pharmacy, and the main nurses' stations. Non-essential areas will remain dark." Someone asked about the isolation wing, and Donovan waved his hand dismissively. "Those rooms are secure. The patients there will be fine until morning. We'll resume normal protocols once power is restored." I tried to speak up, told him we had Jimmy in room 9 who'd just been admitted to isolation that afternoon, but Donovan cut me off. "The isolation wing has been used for decades without power," he said, that condescending tone creeping into his voice. "Those rooms are designed to be safe even in complete darkness. No one can hurt themselves in there." Carl backed him up, mentioned how in the old days before proper electrical systems, they'd keep patients in those rooms for days with just candlelight in the hallways. But something gnawed at me. The way Jimmy had stared at that caged light, the way he'd been counting, always counting. Around midnight, I tried to go check on him anyway, but the corridor to the isolation wing was pitch black, and my flashlight beam barely penetrated 3 feet into that thick darkness. The emergency exits at both ends of the wing had been sealed with chains and padlocks years ago after a patient escaped, so there was only one way in or out. I stood at the threshold for maybe 5 minutes, calling Jimmy's name into the void, but all I heard was the rain hammering against the roof and this weird metallic creaking sound, like pipes expanding and contracting. Saturday crawled by in a haze of emergency protocols and barely controlled chaos. Without proper lighting, half the patients refused to leave their rooms, and the ones who did wandered the dim hallways like ghosts, bumping into walls and crying. We had 2 medical emergencies that nearly turned fatal because we couldn't find supplies fast enough in the dark storage rooms. I kept asking Carl when we could check on the isolation wing, but he brushed me off every time. "Those rooms are soundproof," he'd say. "Even if they're yelling, we wouldn't hear them. They're safer in there than out here with all this confusion." But I noticed he never went near that corridor himself, always found reasons to be on the opposite side of the building. The generators sputtered and coughed all day, threatening to die completely several times. Judith showed me the isolation log from the night shift. The last entry for room 9 was my signature from when we'd admitted Jimmy at 7:47 p.m. Friday. No one had been back since. "It's protocol during power emergencies," she explained, but her voice had this uncertain edge. "We maintain minimum contact to preserve resources." Sunday morning, the power finally came back on at 6:14 a.m. I was in the break room when the fluorescent lights buzzed to life, so bright after 2 days of shadows that everyone had to shield their eyes. Immediately, I headed for the isolation wing, but Carl intercepted me in the main hallway. "We'll do rounds together," he said, but something in his expression had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by this tight nervousness around his mouth. The isolation corridor looked different in the full light. Water had leaked through the ceiling tiles during the storm, creating these dark brown stains that spread across the floor in weird patterns. The air smelled wrong too, metallic and sweet at the same time, like copper pennies mixed with rotting fruit. When we got to room 9, Carl fumbled with his keys, dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. "Jimmy?" he called out before opening it. No response. The door swung inward, and I saw Carl's whole body go rigid. He blocked the doorway with his arm when I tried to look inside. "Get Donovan," he said, his voice barely steady, "and call the state police. Don't let anyone else near this wing." Through the gap under Carl's arm, I caught a glimpse of the room that still visits me in nightmares 40 years later. Jimmy was in the corner, curled into himself, completely still. The padding on the walls, that yellowed foam I'd noticed Friday night, had been torn apart in long vertical strips, like something with claws had raked down them over and over. But it was the bruises that made my throat close up. Purple-black marks covered every visible inch of Jimmy's skin, perfect oval shapes like fingerprints, but the spacing was all wrong, too wide to be from normal hands. His own fingernails were torn and bloody, some completely missing, and there were deep scratches across his face and neck that formed patterns, almost like symbols or letters I couldn't read. The overhead light, the one in the metal cage he'd stared at so intently, was shattered. Glass shards covered the floor, each piece reflecting the harsh fluorescent light from the hallway. On the wall opposite the door, drawn in what looked like blood, were numbers: 7, 14, 21, 23, 23, 23, repeated over and over until they covered the entire surface. But the thing that haunts me most was the position of his body, pressed into that corner like he was trying to push himself through the wall to escape something we couldn't see. The state police arrived within an hour, followed by investigators from the Department of Health. They sealed off the entire isolation wing, took photographs from every angle, measured the bruises, the scratches, documented every number on the wall. The detective in charge, a woman with prematurely gray hair named Detective Reeves, interviewed me for 3 hours straight. She kept coming back to the timeline. When exactly had the lights gone out? Who had made the decision not to check the isolation rooms? Why had it taken 48 hours before anyone entered room 9? I told her about the power outage, about Donovan's orders, about Carl refusing to let anyone near the wing. She wrote everything down in this small spiral notebook, occasionally stopping to examine photos they'd taken of Jimmy's injuries. "These bruise patterns," she said at one point, showing me a close-up image that made my stomach turn. "The medical examiner says they're consistent with restraint marks, but the positioning doesn't make sense. They're on parts of his body he couldn't have reached himself, and they're too uniform to be from a struggle." She paused, tapping her pen against the notebook. "And there's no evidence anyone else entered that room after you and Carl locked him in Friday night. What they found when they investigated further was somehow worse than the scene itself. The security logs, which ran on battery backup, showed that the door to room 9 had never been opened between Friday evening and Sunday morning. The electronic lock registered my keycard at 7:47 p.m. Friday, and then Carl's at 6:31 a.m. Sunday, with nothing in between. But the cameras, the ones that should have been recording the hallway outside the isolation wing, had been deliberately disabled. Not by the power outage. Someone had cut the cables inside the security office Thursday night, before Jimmy was even put in isolation. The maintenance logs showed something else strange. A work order from 2 weeks earlier to inspect the electrical system in room 9, specifically the overhead light fixture. The work was signed off as completed by a maintenance worker named Paul Garrett, but when they tried to find him, HR discovered he'd quit suddenly the day after finishing the job, left no forwarding address, cleared out his on-site apartment in the middle of the night. His employment file had a note from Judith about concerning behavior and inappropriate interest in patient histories, but no one had followed up on it. The investigation went on for weeks, but they never found Paul Garrett. What they did find, hidden in the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the isolation wing, made everyone involved wish they hadn't looked. There was a makeshift living space down there. A mattress, canned goods, bottles of water, and hundreds of photographs tacked to the pipes. Pictures of patients in the isolation rooms, taken through tiny holes that had been drilled through the floors. Some photos went back years, showing patients who'd been discharged or transferred long ago. But there were also journals, dozens of them, filled with observations about the patients, their behaviors, their fears. Jimmy's name appeared frequently in the most recent entries. Garrett had been watching him for months, documenting his number sequences, his mentions of his dead sister. The final entry, dated the day after Garrett supposedly quit, just said, "Room 9 is prepared. The connection is complete. He'll understand when the lights go out." The police theorized that Garrett had rigged something in the electrical system, maybe some kind of remote access to the room, but they never found evidence of how he could have gotten in and out without the door opening. Jimmy survived, if you can call it that. He never spoke again, never made eye contact with anyone, just sat in the corner of whatever room they put him in, drawing numbers on his palms with his finger. Always that same sequence, 7, 14, 21, 23. They transferred him to a state facility in New Jersey, and I heard later that he died there in 1987, cardiac arrest in his sleep. The official investigation concluded that he'd suffered a severe psychotic break during the isolation, exacerbated by the darkness and the storm, and had somehow inflicted all those injuries on himself, despite the physical impossibility of it. Pinewood Behavioral Center closed 6 months after the incident. Not because of Jimmy, Officially, it was due to budget cuts and failing infrastructure, but those of us who worked there knew the truth. After what happened in room 9, none of the staff would go near the isolation wing. Patients started refusing treatment. Families pulled their relatives out. The place just died. They demolished the building in 1984, but before they did, I went back one last time. The isolation wing door was chained shut, but through a gap I could see down that hallway. On the floor, barely visible in the dust and debris, were footprints leading to and from room 9. Fresh footprints, even though the building had been empty for over a year. I never went back after that, never tried to find out more. Some questions don't need answers, some doors should stay locked. I never thought I'd step inside Westridge Psychiatric again, at least not as a patient. Years ago, I worked there as a night nurse. 12-hour shifts filled with screams, sudden code calls, and the strange calm that came just before dawn. After a rough divorce and a spiral that left me barely functioning, I signed myself in. It was humiliating, walking through those same sliding doors with a wristband instead of a key card, seeing familiar corridors through the eyes of someone on the other side. The fluorescent light still buzzed, same sterile hum, same faint smell of antiseptic and burned coffee. The first few nights were ordinary, or as ordinary as they can be in a place like that. My room was on the east wing, quiet, except for the constant murmur of the air vents. I told myself it was the HVAC system, the same one I'd heard hundreds of times during shifts. But one night, lying awake around 3 a.m., I realized the sound wasn't steady. It rose and fell, like a voice struggling to form words. I pressed my ear closer to the vent above my bed, and for a moment I could swear I heard someone crying, soft, broken sobs fading in and out of the metallic echo. The next morning I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was another patient crying somewhere down the hall, the sound bouncing through the ducts. Still, it lingered in my head all day. That rhythm, that desperation. Later, while I sat in the common area coloring to keep my hands busy, I caught another sound coming from the vent above the TV. A man whispering something I couldn't quite make out. The other patients didn't seem to notice. When I asked one of the orderlies about it, he gave me a blank stare and said the vents hadn't worked in years. Central system's been dead since the fire, he added, walking off like it was nothing. That night, I moved my mattress closer to the wall under the vent. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't slipping back into the same hallucinations that had landed me there. I waited in the dark, eyes on the faint green glow of the exit sign. Around the same hour, the whispering began again, clearer this time. A woman's voice trembling, pleading for someone named Dr. Lang. Then a deeper voice snapped back, harsh, commanding. I knew that tone. It was the same one I'd heard from the old head psychiatrist years ago during emergency evaluations. Except, Dr. Lang had died almost 20 years earlier. By the 5th night, sleep had become impossible. Every time the building went still, the vents filled with voices, sometimes sobbing, sometimes laughter, sometimes long stretches of silence broken by sudden bursts of shouting. It wasn't random noise. It sounded like entire conversations cut into fragments. I started recognizing certain tones, the way someone gasped or hesitated, as if these were real people trapped in a loop. I tried recording it with the small tape player they gave me for therapy notes, but every playback was blank, just static, and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I reported it to the staff the following morning, expecting someone to at least check the ducts. Instead, they called the attending psychiatrist, Dr. Hillman, who smiled too easily and told me I was projecting unresolved trauma. Within an hour, they adjusted my medication and moved me to another wing, the one furthest from the East Hall. The walls there were thicker, newer, painted pale green instead of the faded beige I knew. For a while it worked. No whispers, no crying, just the low rattle of the heating system. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It felt staged, like a recording had simply been paused. One afternoon, during occupational therapy, a maintenance worker came by to fix a flickering light. I asked him if he'd ever heard voices through the vents in the old wing. He laughed softly and said, "Lady, those vents haven't carried air since before I started here." I pressed him for more, and his face changed. His eyes dropped to the floor. "There used to be a tape system for observation," he said, almost whispering. "Back when they recorded patient sessions, they fed the wires through the same ducts, but that was before they sealed them." Then he realized he'd said too much and packed his tools faster than I could ask anything else. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew where the old observation room was, behind the locked storage area near the east exit. I waited until lights out, then slipped out with a flashlight I'd hidden in my pillowcase. The hall was dead quiet except for the distant creak of pipes cooling. When I reached the old door, I noticed the padlock was new, shiny compared to the corroded hinges. I hesitated for a long time before pushing the light through a small gap near the handle. The beam landed on a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting on a metal shelf, coated in dust, but still plugged in. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, listening to the low hum of something alive behind that door. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement inside, like the reflection of someone pacing slowly. But when I leaned closer, the sound returned. The same woman's voice I'd heard through the vents pleading again for Dr. Lang. It wasn't coming from the room itself, but from deep within the wall, traveling through metal and plaster. The air felt charged, like a storm was building somewhere underground. I went to the nurse's station, trying to explain what I'd found, but before I could finish, they called for security. The orderlies led me back to my room, injected something clear into my IV, and told me to rest. I remember drifting in and out, the ceiling above me bending slightly each time I blinked. Somewhere between sleep and waking, I heard the same whispering start again, but this time the voices said my name. They spoke softly, almost kindly, as if welcoming me back. When I woke up, I was in a different room, smaller, windowless, walls painted white. Dr. Hillman told me I'd had an episode, and that I'd be discharged soon if I cooperated. But something about his tone felt rehearsed, the way he avoided eye contact when I asked about the East Wing. A few days later, during my final evaluation, a young intern accidentally handed me the wrong folder. It contained maintenance logs from the old ventilation system. The last entry dated 15 years before I was ever hired. The note beside it read, "Vent ducts permanently sealed after audio monitoring discontinued. Tapes archived in storage C." I was released a week later. I tried to put it behind me, to tell myself it was all part of the breakdown, a mind trying to make sense of static. But every now and then when the house is quiet and the air conditioner kicks in, I swear I can still catch it. Faint, somewhere in the hiss of the vents. A voice, soft and cracked, repeating my name the way it did that night. It always stops after the same 3 words, "We hear you." The hospital cafeteria smelled like bleach and boiled vegetables most days. I'd been working there for 3 months, doing whatever needed to be done, cleaning trays, changing linens, helping nurses move patients who were too weak to stand. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough for rent and gas, and in a town like ours, that counted as stability. The place was old, built in the 1950s, with peeling paint that no one ever bothered to fix because the funding's coming next quarter. Everyone said that every quarter. My shift usually started at noon, but the supervisor liked to shuffle schedules without notice. That's how I ended up in the nutrition ward one afternoon. The hallway there was quieter than anywhere else, lined with faded murals of fruits and smiling kids that looked more like ghosts than encouragement. The staff said it was part of a dietary research program, but the kids inside barely spoke, and the ones who did sounded too tired to finish sentences. There was one girl who caught my attention almost immediately. Her name was Emily. She couldn't have been more than 11, with hair so light it looked white under the fluorescent lights. Her chart said she was on a restricted protein intake trial. She'd always greet me when I brought in her tray, even if it was just boiled rice or some flavorless broth. Her voice was soft, like she was saving every word for when it really mattered. I started timing my cleaning rounds to match her meal times, just so I could talk to her a little. Over the next couple of weeks, Emily got thinner. Her wrists looked fragile, like the hospital band alone could bruise her. I mentioned it once to a nurse named Dana, who told me not to worry. The doctors are monitoring everything. But the doctors never came around when I was there. The only people I saw were interns with clipboards, and these black binders they never let out of their sight. Every note they took felt rehearsed, like they already knew the answers before asking any questions. One day, I walked into the ward and her bed was empty. The sheets were folded, the pillow perfectly centered, and her chart was gone from the wall slot. I assumed she'd been moved to another unit, but when I asked around, the answers didn't make sense. Dana said she'd been transferred for observation, yet nobody could tell me to which floor. When I checked the patient log, her name wasn't there at all. It was as if Emily had never been admitted. That night, I stayed past my shift under the excuse of restocking supplies. Around 2 a.m., the hall lights dimmed to half brightness, and the whole floor turned unnervingly still. I crept toward the office the interns used, the one with the frosted glass window. Inside, I could hear muffled voices, 2 men and a woman, discussing reclassification and non-compliance. Then someone mentioned the girl who failed the intake protocol. I didn't need a name to know who they were talking about. When the door opened, I ducked into the storage room across the hall. They wheeled out a stretcher covered in a thin white sheet, and the shape beneath it was far too small to be an adult. I caught a glimpse of a pale wrist with the hospital band still on. I couldn't see the name, but I recognized the faded blue ink stain near the edge. Emily had accidentally marked it with her pen one day when she drew a little flower for me on her napkin. My throat went dry. They were taking her through the back corridor that led straight to the basement. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went straight to records. The clerk, a guy named Ellis who'd been there for decades, told me the nutrition ward files were restricted by administration. I asked why a child's file would be classified like that. He leaned closer and said quietly, "Those kids aren't admitted under pediatrics. They're under research subjects." That word, subjects, hit harder than anything else he could have said. That afternoon, I went back to the ward pretending to deliver linens. The air there felt heavier, and I noticed one of the doors, Emily's old room, had been repainted a shade darker than the rest. On the table inside, there was a new tray of untouched food and a different name tag. But the smell lingered, the same faint antiseptic mixed with something sour, like spoiled formula. I couldn't stay long before one of the interns spotted me and told me that area was off limits until further notice. Her tone was polite, but her eyes said, "Get out now." A few days later, the hospital released an internal memo saying a child from the nutrition ward had died of complications due to malnutrition. The note didn't mention her by name. The next morning, the trial banners outside were gone, replaced by posters about community wellness programs. I overheard staff whispering that the diet research wasn't officially approved by the ethics board. The funding had come from a private sponsor whose name nobody seemed to know. Everyone acted like nothing had happened, but the ward stayed half empty after that. I tried filing a report through the patient advocacy office, but they told me my account didn't align with official documentation. I asked if I could at least talk to the attending physician listed on her case, and the clerk said that doctor had resigned the same week the memo went out. When I pressed for more information, they threatened to terminate my position for violating confidentiality protocols. That's when I realized they weren't trying to hide a mistake. They were covering up a pattern. I quit 2 weeks later. Before leaving, I found one of Emily's drawings tucked under a stack of diet logs. Just a tiny flower sketched in blue ink. I kept it folded in my wallet for years. Every now and then I still check the news hoping someone will uncover what really happened in that ward. But there's never been a single article, not even a mention. Maybe that's the most disturbing part, how something so cruel can happen right in front of everyone and still vanish without a trace. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Working the North Slope oil fields in Alaska isn't for everyone. The isolation gets to you after a while. Nothing but white tundra and frozen darkness for months on end. I'd been doing pipeline maintenance up near Prudhoe Bay for about 6 years when this happened, February 2018. The money was good, real good, which is why guys like me, Brad, and Tommy kept coming back season after season. We were a tight crew, had each other's backs through blizzards and equipment failures that could kill you faster than you could radio for help. That particular rotation, we just finished a week-long repair job on a section of pipe that had developed stress fractures from the constant freeze-thaw cycles. The company put us up in one of those prefab shelters about 40 miles south of Deadhorse, right off the Dalton Highway. You know, that ice road the truckers use. The drive back should have been routine. We'd done it 100 times before in Brad's modified Ford F-350, the kind with chains on all 4 tires and enough heating to keep you from turning into a popsicle. Tommy was sprawled across the back seat, catching up on sleep while I rode shotgun, keeping Brad company as he navigated through what was shaping up to be a decent snowstorm. Visibility was maybe 30 feet on a good stretch. The headlights just bounced off the swirling snow, creating this hypnotic tunnel of white that made you feel like you were flying through space. We were about 2 hours into the drive when Brad suddenly hit the brakes hard enough to throw Tommy into the back of my seat. Through the windshield, barely visible in the storm, was a figure stumbling along the side of the road. No vehicle in sight, no emergency lights, just this person in what looked like a heavy parka, moving in that desperate, uncoordinated way people do when hypothermia starts setting in. Brad pulled over immediately. You don't leave anyone out in that kind of weather. Not when it's 40 below and getting worse. Tommy jerked awake, cursing about the sudden stop, but shut up quick when he saw what we were looking at. The 3 of us sat there for maybe 5 seconds, watching this guy struggle through knee-deep snow about 20 yards ahead. His parka was one of those old military surplus ones, olive green with fur trim around the hood that kept whipping around in the wind. What struck me as odd right away was how he was walking. Not the stumbling gait of someone fighting the cold, but this mechanical, repetitive motion, like he was following a track only he could see. Brad honked the horn twice, but the guy didn't even turn his head. Just kept moving forward, 1 foot after the other, arms hanging loose at his sides. Jesus Christ, he's gonna die out there, Tommy said, already reaching for his door handle. Brad threw the truck in park and we all piled out, the wind hitting us like 1,000 tiny knives. Even with our heavy gear, the cold tried to crawl through every gap, every zipper. We started jogging toward the guy, calling out, our voices getting swallowed by the storm. When we got within 10 feet, Brad grabbed his shoulder to turn him around, and that's when things got weird. The man's face was pale. I mean paper white, but not frostbitten. His eyes were this cloudy gray color, like dirty ice, and they seemed to look right through us. He had maybe 3 days of stubble, dark against that unnatural white skin, and his lips were moving constantly, forming words we couldn't hear over the wind. But it was the scar that made Brad take a step back, a jagged line running from his left temple down to his jaw, the kind of mark that tells you someone survived something they probably shouldn't have. Sir, are you okay?" Tommy shouted, waving his hand in front of the man's face. No response. The guy just stood there, swaying slightly, those cloudy eyes fixed on something beyond us, beyond the storm, beyond everything. His lips never stopped moving, and when I leaned in closer, fighting every instinct telling me to back away, I could just make out what he was repeating. 247, 247, 247, over and over like a broken record. Brad and Tommy exchanged looks. We'd all heard stories about people going crazy from the isolation up here, but this was different. This felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain. We had to get him in the truck, though. Ethics aside, leaving him would mean explaining a frozen corpse to the state troopers, and none of us needed that paperwork. It took all three of us to guide him to the Ford. He didn't resist, but he didn't help either. Just let us move him like a mannequin, his body stiff and cold even through the parka. The weird thing was, he didn't shiver. You spend enough time in the Arctic, you know that shivering is your body's last defense against the cold. When that stops, you're in trouble. But this guy, his skin was ice cold and he wasn't shivering at all. We got him in the back with Tommy, who pressed himself against the far door like he was trying to phase through it. Brad cranked the heat to maximum and pulled back onto the Dalton. For about 10 minutes, nobody said anything. The only sounds were the heater fan on full blast and those lips still moving, still forming those same numbers. Then Tommy cleared his throat and said what we were all thinking. Guys, doesn't he look like that missing snowmobiler from a couple years back? The one they found the sled but never the body? Brad's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. I remembered that story. Everyone who worked the slope did. February 2016, a local guy named Christopher Vaughn went missing during a solo snowmobile trip. They found his sled wrapped around a tree about 15 miles from where we picked up our passenger, blood on the seat, drag marks leading into the woods that just stopped. Search teams looked for 2 weeks before calling it. In that kind of cold, without shelter, you've got maybe a few hours. They declared him dead, had a memorial service and everything. His brother worked for one of the drilling companies, used to drink at the same bar in Deadhorse. Said Christopher had that exact scar from a childhood accident with a boat propeller. The more I looked at our silent passenger in the rearview mirror, the more my gut churned. Same scar, same face shape, even the same color eyes. Though Christopher's had been brown in the photos, not this milky gray. The shelter appeared through the storm like a metal oasis, its yellow lights barely penetrating the white wall of snow. We radioed ahead but got nothing but static, which wasn't unusual in weather like this. The building was one of those modular units the oil companies scatter along the pipeline route, basically a reinforced shipping container with bunks, a kitchenette, and a communication setup. Brad parked as close to the door as possible, and we prepared to move our passenger inside. That's when he spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and wrong, like someone talking through water. Can't go in, not yet, not until 2:47. Tommy actually jumped, banging his head on the doorframe, but we weren't leaving anyone in the truck to freeze regardless of what they wanted. It took Brad bear hugging him from behind, while Tommy and I each took an arm, but we managed to get him through the door. The second we crossed the threshold, he went completely limp, dead weight that nearly took us all to the floor. We laid him on one of the bottom bunks, and Brad went to check the radio while Tommy put water on for coffee. I stayed with our guest, checking his pulse, slow but steady, and trying to make sense of what we'd found. Up close, under the harsh fluorescent lights, more details jumped out. His fingernails were way too long, curved and yellowish, like he hadn't cut them in months. There was no smell though, which bothered me more than it should have. Someone who'd been wandering the wilderness should reek of sweat, body odor, something. But there was nothing, just this neutral, almost sterile absence of scent. His parka pockets were empty except for a single item that made my chest tighten, a snowmobile key on a leather fob, the kind they sold at the Deadhorse gas station. The leather was cracked and weathered, and branded into it was C. Vaughn 2015. Tommy came back with the coffee and saw me holding the key. His face went pale, and he set the mugs down so hard coffee sloshed everywhere. "That's not possible," he whispered, but we both knew it was right there in my hand. Brad came back from the radio room shaking his head. Storm was interfering with everything. We were stuck until it passed, probably another 8 to 10 hours. That's when the power flickered. Just once, but enough to make us all look up at the ceiling. These shelters had backup generators that kicked in automatically, so power issues were rare. The lights steadied, but something had changed in the room. Our passenger's eyes were open, staring directly at the clock on the wall. 11:30 p.m. His lips started moving again, faster this time, that same mantra. 2:47. Tommy grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Right now, storm or no storm." But Brad was already shaking his head, pointing at the window where the snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see the truck parked 10 feet away. We were trapped, and somewhere deep in my lizard brain, I had the feeling that was exactly what was supposed to happen. The next few hours crawled by like molasses. We took turns watching our visitor while trying to maintain some pretense of normalcy. Brad made sandwiches nobody ate. Tommy cleaned his tools for the third time. I kept checking the weather outside, hoping for any sign of a break. The man never moved from the bunk, just lay there with his eyes locked on that clock, lips moving in their endless countdown. Around 2 a.m., exhaustion hit us hard. Tommy volunteered for first watch while Brad and I grabbed bunks on the opposite side of the room. I didn't think I'd sleep, but the adrenaline crash knocked me out cold. I woke to Tommy shaking me violently, his eyes wide with panic. The clock read 2:46 a.m. Brad was already up, standing by the door with a wrench in his hand. "He's gone," Tommy gasped. I just looked away for a second to check the coffee pot, and when I turned back, the bunk was empty. We searched the shelter, all 40 feet of it, but there was nowhere to hide. The man had simply vanished. That's when we heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the metal door. Slow, measured. The kind of knock that says someone knows exactly what they're doing. 2:47 a.m. The knocking came again, this time from the window on the north wall, then the south window, then back to the door. It circled the shelter like something was walking around outside, testing each entrance. Brad gripped the wrench tighter. "That's impossible," he said. "Nobody could survive out there without gear." But we all knew our visitor hadn't exactly been normal. The knocking stopped at 2:48, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like pressure in our ears. We stayed frozen like that until dawn, nobody willing to be the first to move. When the storm finally broke around 7 a.m., we made a discovery that sent us racing for the truck. There were no footprints anywhere around the shelter. Not leading away from the door, not under the windows, nothing. The snow was pristine, untouched, but Tommy never made it to the truck. When Brad and I turned around, he was just gone. No sound, no struggle, no tracks. Just empty air where he'd been standing 2 seconds before. We tore out of there and didn't stop until we hit Fairbanks. Filed a missing person report. Told them about picking up the stranger. Left out the part about him possibly being Christopher Vaughn. The troopers found Tommy's body 3 days later, 15 miles from the shelter in the exact spot where Vaughn's snowmobile had crashed. Frozen solid, lips blue, with drag marks in the snow that just stopped. The nights at mile 237 fuel stops stretched endlessly, each one bleeding into the next until time lost all meaning. I'd been there since early November, manning the counter while Arctic winds rattled the windows and 18-wheelers rolled past like ghosts on the Dalton Highway. The job paid well enough for a college student trying to save money, and the owner, an old guy named Eugene, didn't ask too many questions when I needed extra shifts. Most nights passed without incident. Truckers grabbing coffee, locals filling up their tanks, maybe the occasional tourist who'd gotten turned around in the storm. The station itself wasn't much to write home about. 2 pumps out front, a small convenience store stocked with overpriced snacks, and a bathroom that barely functioned when the pipes weren't frozen solid. Everything changed on my third Wednesday there. The clock had just hit 2 a.m. when I noticed headlights cutting through the blizzard outside. An old Chevy pickup, rust eating through its blue paint job, pulled up to pump number 4 and just stopped. The driver didn't get out, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't even turn off the engine. He just sat there, visible only as a dark silhouette through the frost-covered windshield. After about 10 minutes, I figured maybe he was having car trouble or had fallen asleep, but when I grabbed my jacket to go check on him, the truck suddenly reversed and disappeared back into the storm. Strange, sure, but in a place like that, strange was relative. I made a note in the logbook and went back to restocking the energy drinks, figuring that would be the end of it. The following Wednesday arrived with another blizzard, worse than the last one. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and the wind made the whole building creak like an old ship. Eugene had warned me about nights like these, said sometimes the weather got so bad that even the truckers would hunker down rather than risk the highway. I was counting inventory in the back room, trying to stay busy, when I heard the familiar rumble of an engine outside. The clock on the wall showed exactly 2 a.m. Through the security monitor, I watched that same blue Chevy pull up to pump 4, same spot as before, and the driver did the exact same thing. Absolutely nothing. This time I got a better angle on the camera, could make out more details. The man wore what appeared to be a heavy winter coat with the hood up, and his hands gripped the steering wheel at precisely 10 and 2. He never adjusted his position, never reached for the radio, never even seemed to breathe. I let it go on for 15 minutes this time before deciding to approach him. The moment I stepped toward the door, keys in hand, the truck's reverse lights flared to life. By the time I pushed through the wind and snow to reach pump 4, nothing remained but tire tracks already being erased by the storm. The whole thing left me unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. There was something mechanical about his movements, or lack thereof, like watching a video on loop. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every set of headlights that passed, but the blue Chevy didn't return. When Eugene came in for the morning shift, I mentioned it to him, trying to keep my tone casual. He just shrugged and said, "We got all kinds out here, especially during storm season." But I noticed he avoided making eye contact when he said it, and his fingers drummed nervously on the counter. By the third Wednesday, I'd prepared myself. I'd even switched shifts with Jasmine specifically to be there at 2 a.m., though I didn't tell her the real reason. The security system at the station was ancient but functional, a setup from the early 2000s that recorded everything on a loop, overwriting footage after 7 days. I'd figured out how to save clips to a USB drive, and I had one ready in my pocket. The storm that night was lighter, just steady snow instead of a full blizzard, which meant better visibility. I positioned myself behind the counter with a clear view of pump 4, pretending to read a magazine while I waited. At 1:58 a.m., I heard it, that distinctive engine rumble growing louder as it approached from the north. The blue Chevy materialized from the darkness like it had been summoned, pulling into the exact same spot with practiced precision. This time, I was ready with the camera controls, zooming in as close as the old system would allow. What I saw made my skin crawl. The man in the driver's seat wasn't just still, he was impossibly still. No Weishao de toe boo movements from breathing, no shifting to get comfortable, no fidgeting or checking mirrors. His face remained hidden beneath that heavy hood, but his hands on the wheel looked wrong somehow. The skin had a grayish tint, even accounting for the poor camera quality, and the fingers seemed too rigid, like they'd been frozen in place. I recorded everything, my pulse hammering as I watched him sit there for exactly 10 minutes. Then, right on schedule, the reverse lights came on. But this time, instead of backing straight out, the truck turned slightly, and for just a second, the driver's side faced directly toward the camera. The hood fell back just enough for me to glimpse his face, and what I saw sent me stumbling backward into the cigarette display. The features were human but wrong, sunken eyes that didn't reflect any light, skin that looked like old leather, and an expression of complete emptiness. No recognition, no emotion, nothing that suggested a living person sat behind that wheel. The truck vanished into the night before I could recover my composure. I spent the next hour replaying the footage, trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood what I'd seen, that the poor lighting and old camera had played tricks on me. But each viewing only confirmed my initial impression. Whoever or whatever sat in that truck wasn't right. I saved multiple copies of the recording and started digging through the station's old logbooks, going back months, then years. Eugene kept meticulous records in a storage closet behind the break room, dusty binders filled with delivery schedules, maintenance reports, and incident logs dating back to the station's opening in 1987. That's when I found the first mention, December 1993. A note about a customer complaint regarding an abandoned vehicle at Pump 4 during the 2 a.m. hour. The description matched perfectly. Blue Chevy pickup, lone male driver, never exits the vehicle. The entries appeared sporadically after that, always on Wednesdays, always during winter storms, always at exactly 2 a.m. The real shock came when I found a folder labeled Incident Reports, Law Enforcement, tucked behind the older logs. Inside were photocopied police reports, missing person flyers, and newspaper clippings. One caught my attention immediately, an article from January 1992 about a local man named Walter Hendricks, who'd disappeared during a severe blizzard. He'd been driving home from his job at a mining camp when his truck, a blue 1988 Chevy Silverado, vanished somewhere along the Dalton Highway. Search parties found no trace of him or the vehicle, despite extensive efforts. The article included a photo of Walter, and even in the grainy newspaper reproduction, I recognized those sunken features. But it was the last document in the folder that made me drop everything and reach for my phone. Someone had run the truck's license plate 2 years ago and attached the results. The plate belonged to Walter Hendricks, and according to DMV records, it had been registered to a vehicle declared missing in January 1992, over 30 years ago. I tried calling Eugene, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next Wednesday loomed just 2 days away, and I couldn't decide whether to quit immediately or stay to confront whatever kept returning to Pump 4. Curiosity won out, along with a strange sense of obligation, like I needed to understand this for Walter's sake, wherever he really was. I spent those 2 days researching everything I could find about the disappearance. Walter had been 28 when he vanished, worked rotating shifts at the Red Dog mine, and left behind a wife and infant daughter. The search efforts had been hampered by the blizzard that night, with visibility near zero and temperatures dropping to 40 below. One detail from the police report stood out. Walter's last radio contact with the mining camp mentioned stopping for gas, though he never specified where. The timeline would have put him near mile 237 around 2 a.m., right when the storm hit its peak. I also discovered something else in the newspaper archives. 3 other people had gone missing along that stretch of highway over the years, all during winter storms, all late at night. None of them were ever found. Wednesday arrived with clear skies for once, stars visible through the station windows and the temperature hovering around -20. I'd convinced myself that maybe the clear weather would break the pattern, that whatever brought Walter's truck back only came with the storms. But at 1:45 a.m., clouds rolled in from nowhere, bringing snow that fell in thick, heavy sheets. By 1:55, visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and I knew he'd come. I'd prepared everything: fresh batteries in my flashlight, my phone fully charged, Eugene's number on speed dial, and a baseball bat from the storage room tucked behind the counter. At exactly 2 a.m., those familiar headlights pierced through the snow. The blue Chevy rolled up to Pump 4 with that same mechanical precision, and Walter, or the thing that used to be Walter, sat behind the wheel in his eternal vigil. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight and bat, took a deep breath, and pushed out into the storm. The cold hit like a physical force, stealing my breath and making my eyes water instantly. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, reducing the world to a white void broken only by the dim glow of the station lights and the idling truck. As I approached Pump 4, fighting against the wind with every step, I noticed something that hadn't been visible on the cameras. The snow around the truck fell differently, creating a perfect circle where not a single flake touched the vehicle. Even stranger, the windows showed no fog from breathing, no condensation from body heat. The interior looked as cold as the air outside. I reached the driver's side door, my flashlight beam catching that terrible face in profile. Up close, Walter's features were even more disturbing. Skin like old parchment stretched over bone, eyes that were open but saw nothing, lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-word. I raised my hand to knock on the window, and that's when everything went sideways. The moment my knuckles made contact with the glass, the station's power cut out completely. The pumps went dark, the building behind me vanished into blackness, and even my flashlight flickered and died. In that sudden darkness, I heard the truck's door creak open for the first time. The emergency generator should have kicked in within seconds, but the darkness stretched on. I stumbled backward, swinging the bat blindly while trying to restart my flashlight with numb fingers. Then, impossibly, I saw light coming from inside the station. Not the harsh fluorescence, but a soft, pale glow emanating from the windows. Through the snow, I could make out a figure standing inside, perfectly still, facing outward. The proportions were wrong, too tall and too thin, but I recognized the heavy winter coat and the hollow face. Walter stood inside the locked station, on the wrong side of the front window, staring out at me. Frost spread across the glass from where he stood, forming intricate patterns that crept outward like frozen veins. The really horrifying part was that I could still hear the truck idling behind me, engine running smooth and steady. I turned my head just enough to confirm what I already knew. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open like a mouth. When I looked back at the station, Walter had moved closer to the glass, close enough that I could see every detail of his ruined face, those empty eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my chest tight with panic. The sound that came next will haunt me forever. A voice like wind through a frozen pipe, muffled by the glass but clear enough to understand. Still, looking for Pump 4. Each word came out slow and labored, accompanied by more frost spreading across the window, until the entire storefront was white with ice. I backed away, slipping on the snow-covered ground, the bat useless in my shaking grip. Behind me, the truck's engine suddenly revved, headlights flashing in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. The pale glow inside the station began to pulse in sync with the lights, and I realized with growing horror that Walter wasn't alone in there. Shadows moved behind him, other figures in winter gear all standing at the windows now. 4 of them total, including Walter, matching the number of missing persons I'd read about. They all stared out with those same empty eyes, mouths moving in unison to form words I couldn't hear over the storm. The frost on the windows began forming letters spelled out in ice. "Help us find the way." I ran. Not back to the truck, not to the highway, but around the building to the employee entrance, fumbling with my keys while those dead eyes tracked my movement through every window. The door finally gave way and I burst inside, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt. The emergency lights suddenly blazed to life, revealing an empty store. No figures at the windows, no frost on the glass. Everything normal except for the thundering of my own heartbeat. But the truck was still out there. I could hear it idling at Pump 4. I called 911 with trembling fingers, babbling about intruders and power outages, anything to get someone else there. While waiting, I grabbed the USB drive with the footage and stuffed it in my pocket, then noticed something that made me sick. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m., but according to my phone, only 10 minutes had passed since the power went out. The responding officer found nothing. No truck, no footprints except mine. No frost damage to the windows. The next morning I gave Eugene my resignation, packed my things and left Alaska entirely. But sometimes, on winter nights when the snow falls heavy, I still dream about Pump 4 and those words traced in ice. I never found out what they were looking for, and honestly, I hope I never do. October 2019 was when everything changed between me and my dad. We'd planned this moose hunt up in Alaska's Copper River Basin for months. Our first real father-son trip since I'd moved to Seattle for work 3 years earlier. I'm 28, do IT consulting, and honestly hadn't spent more than a weekend with the old man since college. He'd been hunting that region for over 2 decades, knew every ridge and creek like they were extensions of his own backyard. We drove up from Anchorage in his trusty Chevy Silverado, rifles secured, camping gear packed tight, both of us genuinely excited about disconnecting from the world for 5 straight days. The plan seemed straightforward: track some moose, maybe get lucky with a clean shot, and just enjoy the wilderness without cell towers or work emails buzzing in our pockets. The first day unfolded exactly as we'd hoped. We hiked roughly 6 miles from our parking spot, found a solid campsite near this narrow creek that cut through a valley surrounded by dense spruce and birch. Dad had that confident swagger he always got in the woods, pointing out animal signs, explaining wind patterns, sharing stories about previous hunts in the area. The weather was crisp but not brutal, maybe 35 degrees with clear skies, and that perfect autumn light filtering through the trees. We set up our tent, organized our gear, and spent the evening planning our route for the next morning while sharing a thermos of coffee spiked with whiskey. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. We were both tired from the hike, talking quietly about family stuff, work stress, life in general. Neither of us had any idea that we were already being watched. The weirdness started on day 2. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours, following this game trail that wound up through a series of rocky outcrops, when Dad stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring at something about 30 yards ahead, his expression shifting from casual interest to genuine confusion. When I caught up to him, I saw what had grabbed his attention: scattered pieces of what used to be a caribou, but not like any kill I'd ever seen before. The bones were picked completely clean, almost surgically precise, but the strange part was how the pieces were arranged. They weren't just randomly scattered like a normal predator kill would be. Instead, they formed this weird pattern, almost like they'd been deliberately placed in a rough circle around a flat boulder. The skull sat right in the center, empty sockets staring up at the gray sky, and the larger bones radiated outward like spokes on a wheel. Dad knelt down next to the remains, running his fingers along the clean bone edges. He'd been hunting for over 20 years, seen plenty of bear kills, wolf packs feeding, even mountain lion attacks. But this was different. The bones were too clean, too organized, and there wasn't a single track anywhere in the soft earth around the site. Not even a partial paw print or scuff mark. "Kevin," he said quietly, using my full name, which he only did when he was seriously concerned. "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever did this, it's big enough to take down a full-grown caribou, but smart enough to not leave any evidence behind." We spent another 10 minutes examining the area, circling wider and wider, but found absolutely nothing. No fur, no blood trail, no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. It was like the animal had just materialized, arranged these bones with surgical precision, then vanished into thin air. We tried to shake it off and continued our hunt, but the discovery had clearly rattled both of us. Dad kept glancing back toward the bone site, and I caught myself scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. About 2 miles further up the trail, we found another kill, this time a ptarmigan, but again the remains were arranged in that same unnatural pattern. The small bones formed a perfect miniature circle around a smooth river stone, with the tiny skull positioned exactly in the center. What made it even more disturbing was that ptarmigans are ground birds, easy prey for foxes or hawks, but there were no feathers scattered around, no signs of a struggle, nothing that would indicate a normal predator-prey encounter. Dad picked up one of the delicate wing bones and held it up to the light, showing me how cleanly it had been stripped of meat. "This is surgical work," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No animal does this kind of precision cleaning naturally." The pattern continued throughout the day. We found 5 more kill sites, each one more unsettling than the last. A ground squirrel arranged around a piece of quartz, a marten's bones forming a perfect circle around a flat piece of shale. Each site was immaculate, sterile almost, with that same eerie precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. What really got to me was the escalation. The kills were getting fresher as we moved deeper into the basin. The first caribou had been there for days, maybe weeks, but the last few sites still had that metallic smell of recent death clinging to them. Dad started walking differently, keeping his rifle ready, constantly checking behind us. Neither of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we both knew something was tracking our movements, staying just far enough ahead to prepare these grotesque displays for us to find. It was like we were being led deeper into its territory, following a trail of increasingly fresh kills that served as both warning and invitation. That night, we made camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick spruce trees, both of us too on edge to venture further. Dad insisted we keep the fire burning all night, taking turns on watch even though we'd never done that on previous camping trips. I drew the first shift, sitting with my back against a fallen log, rifle across my lap, listening to every snap of branches and rustle of leaves in the darkness beyond our firelight. Around 2 a.m. during Dad's watch, I woke up to the sound of him whispering my name urgently. When I opened my eyes, he was pointing toward the opposite side of the clearing, his face pale in the flickering orange glow. "There," he breathed, "between those two big spruces. Don't move too fast, but tell me what you see." I turned my head slowly, following his gaze, and that's when I saw them. Two enormous yellow eyes reflecting our firelight, positioned about 8 feet off the ground, completely motionless. They weren't the typical green eyeshine you'd expect from a deer or moose, but this intense, almost golden color that seemed to pulse with intelligence. The eyes watched us for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. They never blinked, never moved, just maintained that steady, calculating stare that made my skin crawl. Dad had his rifle trained on the spot, but neither of us could make out any body shape or outline in the darkness behind those eyes. Whatever was watching us was massive. The eye placement alone suggested something significantly larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever encountered. The strangest part was how absolutely silent it was. No breathing sounds, no movement of vegetation, no shifting of weight from one foot to another. Just those unblinking eyes studying us with what felt like predatory patience. When dawn finally started to break and the first gray light began filtering through the trees, the eyes simply vanished. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, as if they'd never existed at all. We searched the area thoroughly once we had enough light, but found no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no physical evidence that anything had been there. Day 3 changed everything. We'd been hiking for about 4 hours, both of us jumpy and exhausted from the sleepless night, when we reached the ridgeline overlooking the main valley. Dad was using his binoculars to scan for moose sign when he suddenly went completely rigid. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, handing me the binoculars with shaking fingers. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." I adjusted the focus and looked where he was pointing, and there it was. Standing on the opposite ridge, maybe 800 yards away, was the largest wolf I'd ever seen, but calling it a wolf doesn't really do it justice. This thing was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with a massive head and shoulders that seemed too broad for any normal canine. Its fur was almost black, except for these weird silver markings along its spine that caught the sunlight like metal. What made my heart race was the way it was standing, completely still, facing directly toward us, like it had been waiting for us to reach that exact spot. The wolf stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just watching us through what must have been its own incredible vision. Even at that distance, I could feel the weight of its attention, like it was cataloging every detail of our appearance and behavior. Dad was fumbling with his rifle, trying to get a clear shot, but the range was too far for any reliable accuracy. Then, without any warning or gradual movement, the wolf turned and began walking along the ridgeline with this fluid, almost flowing gait that didn't look natural. It moved like liquid shadow, covering ground impossibly fast while maintaining perfect balance on terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain climber. What terrified me most was how it would stop every 100 yards or so, turn back toward us, and wait just long enough for us to track its movement before continuing. It was clearly demonstrating that it could outmaneuver us effortlessly, that it had been controlling this entire encounter from the beginning. That's when everything clicked into place for me. The bone arrangements, the fresh kills getting progressively newer as we moved deeper into the basin, the silent nighttime surveillance, and now this calculated display of dominance. We weren't hunting in its territory. We were being hunted by it. This wasn't some random predator protecting its domain. This was something far more intelligent and deliberate. The wolf had been shadowing us for the entire trip, staying just close enough to monitor our movements while leaving those grotesque calling cards to announce its presence. Dad must have reached the same conclusion because he grabbed my arm and said, "We're leaving. Right now. This thing has been playing with us." We packed up our gear with frantic efficiency, abandoning any pretense of continuing the hunt. As we started our descent back toward the valley, I couldn't resist one last look through the binoculars. The wolf was still there, sitting now like some ancient sentinel, watching our retreat with what I swear looked like satisfaction. The hike back to our truck took us 6 hours of non-stop walking, both of us constantly checking the ridge lines and tree lines around us. We didn't speak much during the descent, but I could tell Dad was processing the same unsettling realization that was eating at me. That massive wolf had been orchestrating our entire experience from day one. Every kill site, every strange arrangement of bones, every moment of growing unease had been carefully planned to guide us deeper into its domain until it was ready to reveal itself. When we finally reached the Silverado, Dad threw our gear into the bed with shaking hands and started the engine before I'd even closed my door. As we drove away, I watched the wilderness disappear in the side mirror, and I swear I could still feel those golden eyes tracking our movement. We never went back to that area, and Dad sold his hunting gear the following spring. Neither of us ever talked about what we'd experienced, but I know we both understood that we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. An apex predator with intelligence that bordered on supernatural, and we'd been incredibly lucky to leave its territory alive. The Caribou Migration Project seemed like the perfect opportunity to advance my career as a wildlife biologist. After 6 years of smaller research assignments, I finally had the chance to lead a team studying how climate change was disrupting traditional migration routes near the Yukon River. The assignment came through in late April 2017, and within 2 weeks, I was heading into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team. We were tasked with monitoring 43 GPS-collared caribou over 3 weeks, documenting their movements and behavior patterns. The data we collected would potentially influence conservation policies across the region, making this one of the most important projects I'd ever been involved in. I remember feeling this mixture of excitement and responsibility as we loaded our gear: thermal drones, tracking equipment, camping supplies for an extended stay in some seriously remote territory. Our base camp was established at an old logging site that had been abandoned sometime in the 1980s. The location was ideal for our research purposes: flat ground for equipment setup, close proximity to the river for water access, and positioned directly along one of the main caribou migration corridors. But the place had this unsettling atmosphere that I couldn't quite shake. Rusted machinery sat half-buried under decades of moss and fallen leaves, while rotting wooden structures slowly surrendered to the encroaching forest. My team consisted of Dr. James Mitchell, our experienced project leader, Lisa Chen from the university's wildlife department, and 2 graduate students named Alex and Maria. We'd collaborated on previous assignments, so there was an established workflow to how we organized our campsite, distributed daily responsibilities, and settled into our research routine. The first few days proceeded exactly according to plan, with clear, consistent GPS signals streaming in from all tagged animals. The work itself was methodical and rewarding. Every morning, we'd check our tracking systems while drinking coffee around the portable camp stove, watching dozens of red dots move across our digital maps. The caribou were following their expected routes, clustering in feeding areas during the day and moving steadily northward each night. Lisa handled the thermal drone flights, capturing behavioral footage that would complement our GPS data. Alex and Maria took turns monitoring the radio frequencies, while Dr. Mitchell and I analyzed movement patterns and updated our field notes. The weather held steady, cool mornings, warm afternoons, and crystal clear nights perfect for equipment operation. By day 5, we documented some fascinating deviations from historical migration patterns. Exactly the kind of data that would make our research valuable. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and everything was going according to our carefully planned schedule. During those first several days, I started noticing small details about the abandoned logging site that hadn't been immediately apparent. There were these perfectly straight cut marks on certain trees, far too precise to be natural, suggesting the loggers had used some kind of advanced equipment for their time. The concrete foundations of demolished buildings formed geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like whoever had designed the original layout had some specific organizational system in mind. Most intriguingly, we found several metal plates buried under decades of debris, each one stamped with sequential numbers but no company identification or dates. Dr. Mitchell mentioned that logging operations from that era typically left more obvious traces: marked trees, equipment serial numbers, proper signage. But this place was different, almost sterile in how thoroughly it had been cleared of identifying information. Still, it didn't interfere with our research, and we had more pressing concerns than investigating the site's mysterious past. Everything changed on the night of May 15th. I was reviewing data logs in my tent around 11:30 p.m. when Alex came running from the monitoring station, his face pale in the lantern light. "Heather, you need to see this right now," he said, his voice tight with concern. All 43 GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously at exactly 11:17 p.m. Not gradually, not one by one, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The tracking system showed no error messages, no equipment malfunctions, no technical explanations for the sudden blackout. Lisa ran diagnostics on our receivers while Dr. Mitchell checked the backup systems, but everything on our end was functioning perfectly. We spent the next 3 hours trying to re-establish contact, adjusting frequencies, boosting signal strength, even attempting manual pings to individual callers. Nothing worked. The caribou had simply vanished from our monitoring network, leaving us staring at empty screens and wondering what the hell had just happened. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in the wilderness. Usually, the Canadian forest at night is alive with sounds: owls calling, branches creaking, small animals rustling through undergrowth. But after the signals disappeared, even those familiar noises seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. We decided to take shifts monitoring the equipment through the night, hoping the signals might return as mysteriously as they'd vanished. Dr. Mitchell took the first watch, followed by Lisa, then Alex. When my turn came at 4 a.m., I sat alone in the monitoring tent, surrounded by silent equipment and trying to make sense of what had happened. The GPS system had never failed so completely before, and the timing, all signals cutting out at the exact same moment, suggested something far more serious than a simple technical glitch. I kept checking and rechecking our data logs, hoping to find some pattern or explanation that we'd missed. Dawn brought no relief, just more questions. We packed up quickly and headed out to the last known location of the nearest caribou herd, about 6 miles northeast of our camp. The hike through dense forest was tense, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what we might find. When we reached the area, there was no sign of the animals, no tracks, no droppings, no evidence they'd ever been there. but our equipment was undisturbed, sitting exactly where we'd left it the previous day. Cameras, motion sensors, even the backup GPS units were all functioning normally, still recording data from their positions. It was as if the caribou had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the technology we'd used to monitor them. Lisa suggested we expand our search radius, but Dr. Mitchell was already looking worried about our timeline and resources. We spent the entire day searching a 12-mile area, finding nothing but empty wilderness and the growing certainty that something unprecedented had occurred. That evening, Lisa decided to review the thermal drone footage from the previous night, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the caribou. We gathered around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of grainy infrared video. Most of it showed exactly what we expected: empty forest, occasional small animals moving through the underbrush, the normal thermal signatures of a quiet wilderness night. But at 11:15 p.m., just 2 minutes before the GPS signals disappeared, the footage captured something extraordinary. 7 tall figures emerged from the tree line, moving in perfect synchronization across the open area near our camp. They were definitely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too coordinated, moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost mechanical. The thermal signatures showed they were warmer than the surrounding environment, but cooler than normal human body temperature. Most disturbing was how they moved together, like a single organism with multiple parts, maintaining exact spacing and identical movements as they crossed the frame and disappeared back into the forest on the opposite side. None of us spoke for several minutes after the footage ended. Dr. Mitchell rewound it 3 times, studying every detail, while Alex kept muttering that the equipment must have malfunctioned. But Lisa and I both knew what we were seeing was real. The thermal imaging was too consistent, too detailed to be some kind of technical glitch. The figures were approximately 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and movements that suggested they were intimately familiar with the terrain. They made no sound that the drone's audio equipment could detect, moving across fallen logs and dense undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. What haunted me most was their coordination, not just walking in formation, but actually mirroring each other's movements down to the smallest gesture. When the lead figure raised what appeared to be its arm, all 7 performed the identical motion simultaneously. We watched the clip dozens of times, but it only raised more questions about what we were dealing with and whether it was connected to the caribou disappearance. That night, we implemented a buddy system. No one was allowed to leave their tent alone, and we established regular check-ins every hour until dawn. Despite our precautions, I barely slept, listening to every sound outside and wondering if those figures were still out there, watching us. Around 3 a.m., I heard Maria whispering urgently to Alex in the tent next to mine, but when I called out to ask if everything was okay, she said she'd just had a bad dream. The rest of the night passed without incident, but morning brought a new horror that made the previous day's mysteries seem trivial. When we gathered for breakfast at 7 a.m., Alex was missing. His sleeping bag was empty, his personal belongings still neatly arranged beside his cot, and his boots were gone. We searched the immediate area around camp, calling his name and checking all the places he might have wandered during the night. Dr. Mitchell was already talking about contacting emergency services when I decided to check the riverbank, thinking maybe Alex had gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope. What I found at the water's edge defied every logical explanation I could think of. Alex's hiking boots were placed with mathematical precision on a flat rock, positioned perfectly parallel to each other and facing directly toward the flowing water. The laces were tied in neat bows, exactly as he always wore them, and there wasn't a single scuff mark or piece of mud on the leather. But there were no footprints, not leading to the boots, not leading away from them. Nothing in the soft riverbank soil that would indicate how they'd gotten there. The rock they sat on was completely dry, despite the morning mist that had dampened everything else in the area. I called the others over, and we spent 2 hours examining every inch of the surrounding ground, looking for any trace of Alex's passage. The absence of tracks was absolute and impossible. Even if someone had deliberately erased footprints, there would be signs of the erasure itself. Yet the boots sat there like a carefully arranged display, as if they'd been placed by someone who could move without touching the ground. We packed up camp immediately and hiked back to the nearest communication point to contact the authorities. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced wilderness teams, but no trace of Alex was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, with the working theory being that he'd somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. But that explanation didn't account for the boots, which the investigators dismissed as irrelevant details. 6 months later, I received a call from a forestry worker who'd been conducting surveys in the same area. He'd found something buried under a pile of stones near the old logging site. A GPS collar, still functional, with data showing it had been stationary in that exact location since May 15th at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from our missing caribou, and the timing matched perfectly with when all the signals had disappeared. I never went back to that site, and I've never worked another research project in that region. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Every time someone mentions Alaska, my stomach twists into knots. People always picture the beautiful wilderness and amazing northern lights, but all I can think about is that night at Copper Creek Lodge. At the time, I was fresh out of my junior year at college, taking a seasonal job as a front desk clerk and maintenance helper at this tiny remote lodge near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It was June 2022, and the place was basically my entire world for 3 months. The lodge had 12 small cabins scattered around the property, connected by gravel paths that crunched under your feet no matter how quietly you tried to walk. Our nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, and cell service was absolutely non-existent. The only connection to the outside world was a single landline in the main office that crackled with static on good days. Most nights, the silence was so complete, it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. The guests that week were mostly hikers and photographers, the kind of people who came to Alaska specifically to get away from civilization. There was this couple, David and Amanda, who'd been staying in cabin 7 for 3 days with their friend Troy. David was one of those guys who never seemed to stop talking, always cracking jokes and making everyone laugh during meals in the main lodge. Amanda was quieter, more reserved, but she had this way of watching everything around her like she was constantly taking mental notes. Troy was somewhere in between, friendly enough, but kept to himself most of the time. They'd spend their days hiking the trails around the property and come back every evening completely exhausted, covered in mud and mosquito bites. The dynamic between them seemed normal enough, just 3 friends on a wilderness adventure. But there was this underlying tension I couldn't quite put my finger on, especially between David and Troy. The day everything went wrong started like any other. I'd spent most of it fixing a broken water heater in cabin 3 and restocking supplies in the main lodge. The weather had been unusually warm for June, and by evening the air was thick with mosquitoes and that strange twilight that never quite turns to full darkness during Alaskan summers. Around 9 p.m., I noticed David, Amanda, and Troy heading toward the bathhouse, which was this small wooden building about 100 yards from the main lodge. Troy was carrying a towel and seemed eager to finally get cleaned up after their long hike. David and Amanda were walking behind him, and I could hear David's voice getting louder as they got farther away, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. There was something about his tone that made me pause while I was locking up the office, but I shrugged it off. Guests argued sometimes, especially when they were tired and dealing with the isolation. About an hour later, I was in my small staff cabin reading when I heard voices outside. At first, I thought it was just other guests coming back from the evening activities, but the voices were getting closer and more agitated. Then I heard Amanda's voice, sharp and panicked, calling out something about Troy being missing. I put down my book and listened more carefully. David was with her, and they were moving from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Troy. Their voices had this frantic edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, and that's when Amanda spotted me. She came running over, her face pale even in the dim light, and David was right behind her with this wild look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Amanda kept saying Troy had disappeared after some kind of fight near the bathhouse, but when I asked for details, both of them seemed to stumble over their words. The story they told me kept changing every time I asked a question. First, Amanda said Troy had gotten into an argument with a stranger who was lurking around the bathhouse. Then David jumped in and said the stranger had been there for hours, just watching people come and go. But when I asked what this stranger looked like, Amanda described a tall man with dark hair, while David insisted he was shorter with a beard. Their descriptions were so different it was like they were talking about completely different people. Amanda kept wringing her hands and looking around nervously, while David was pacing back and forth, running his fingers through his hair repeatedly. The whole situation felt wrong, like they were performing some kind of rehearsed panic rather than genuinely worried about their friend. I told them we should check the bathhouse first, and maybe Troy had just wandered off to cool down after whatever argument had happened. But as we walked toward the building, I noticed David kept glancing at Amanda with these quick, meaningful looks that made my skin crawl. The bathhouse was completely empty when we got there, but there were clear signs of some kind of struggle. The wooden bench outside was overturned, and there were scuff marks in the dirt that looked like someone had been dragged or had fallen hard. Amanda immediately started crying and saying they needed to call the police, but when I suggested we use the landline in the main office, David quickly said we should search the property first. He insisted that Troy probably just went for a walk to clear his head and would be back any minute. But the way he said it, with this forced calm in his voice, made me realize he was trying to control the situation. I agreed to help them search, but I was already planning to call the authorities as soon as we got back to the lodge. The three of us spent the next hour combing through the trails with flashlights, calling Troy's name and getting no response. Every shadow seemed threatening, and every sound made us jump. Amanda kept asking what we were going to do, but David kept steering the conversation away from calling for help. When we finally gave up the search around midnight, I was exhausted and genuinely worried about Troy. I told David and Amanda that I was going to call the state troopers from the main office, and that's when David's whole demeanor changed. He grabbed my arm and said we should wait until morning, that Troy would probably show up on his own and we'd just be wasting everyone's time. But Amanda disagreed, saying they needed to call Troy's family and let them know what was happening. The two of them started arguing right there in front of me, and I could hear the desperation in both their voices. David kept insisting that calling the police would just make things worse, while Amanda was practically begging him to let me make the call. During their argument, I noticed David had scratches on his forearms that definitely weren't there earlier in the day, and when I asked him about them, he claimed he'd gotten them while pushing through some bushes during our search. But the scratches looked fresh and deep, like fingernail marks, and they were in a pattern that made me think of someone trying to defend themselves. I finally convinced them that we needed to contact the authorities, and the three of us walked back to the main lodge together. The building felt eerily quiet as I unlocked the office door, and I could hear both David and Amanda breathing heavily behind me. When I picked up the landline phone to dial, there was no dial tone, just complete silence. I jiggled the cord and checked all the connections, but the line was completely dead. David immediately said the phone lines probably went down because of the weather, but there hadn't been any storms that day. Amanda was getting more agitated by the minute, pacing around the small office and muttering about how they needed to get help somehow. I told them I'd drive to the nearest town in the morning to report Troy missing, but David quickly volunteered to go instead. He said he knew the area better and could get there faster, but something about his eagerness to leave made me suspicious. I insisted that we all stay together until we figured out what had happened to Troy, and that's when I noticed David and Amanda exchange another one of those loaded glances. We decided to wait until dawn before making any decisions, and I offered to let them stay in the main lodge instead of going back to their cabin. Amanda accepted immediately, but David seemed reluctant, saying he wanted to go back and get some of their things. I watched him walk toward cabin 7, and something about the way he moved, quick and purposeful, made me decide to follow him at a distance. I grabbed my flashlight and snuck out the back door of the lodge, staying in the shadows as I made my way toward their cabin. David went inside for maybe 10 minutes, and when he came out, he was carrying a large duffel bag that looked much heavier than it should have if he was just getting clothes. He also had something wrapped in a towel tucked under his arm, and he kept looking around nervously as he walked back. I managed to get back to the lodge before him, but I pretended to be dozing in one of the lobby chairs when he returned. Amanda was curled up on the couch, but I could tell she wasn't really sleeping either. The three of us spent the rest of the night in that main room, and I don't think any of us got a minute of real sleep. When the sun finally came up around 4:30 a.m., I suggested we all walk back to the bathhouse area in the daylight to see if we could find any more clues about what happened to Troy. David immediately protested, saying we'd already searched thoroughly and wouldn't find anything new. But Amanda stood up and said she wanted to look again, and after a moment of hesitation, David agreed to come with us. As we walked toward the bathhouse, I noticed David kept positioning himself between Amanda and me, like he was trying to control what we could see or where we could go. The morning light revealed details we'd missed in the dark. There were drops of what looked like dried liquid on the wooden steps of the bathhouse, and the ground around the building was more disturbed than I'd initially realized. Amanda pointed out a torn piece of fabric caught on a nearby bush, and when she started to reach for it, David quickly stepped in and said we shouldn't touch anything that might be evidence. But the way he said it, with this forced authority in his voice, made me wonder if he was trying to preserve evidence or destroy it. Around 7 a.m., I heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching, which was unusual since we rarely got air traffic that early in the morning. David's face went completely white when he heard it, and he started talking rapidly about how they should probably head back to their cabin to pack up and leave. But Amanda was staring at the helicopter with this expression of relief mixed with terror, and she whispered something about hoping it was help. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the main lodge, and 2 state troopers got out along with a paramedic. My first thought was that someone else had called about Troy, but then I realized that was impossible, since our phone lines were down. One of the troopers approached us and asked if we were the people who'd reported a missing person, and before I could answer, David jumped in and said there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed Troy had just wandered off for a walk and had probably already made it back to town on his own. The trooper looked skeptical and asked to speak with each of us separately, starting with Amanda. While Amanda was talking to the officers, David kept trying to convince me that we should tell them everything was fine and that Troy would turn up eventually. He was sweating despite the cool morning air, and he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. But then the paramedic came over and told us they'd found Troy about 2 miles downstream, near the old mining road. He was alive but in critical condition with multiple stab wounds, and they'd already airlifted him to a hospital in Fairbanks. The paramedic said Troy had managed to crawl to the road and flag down a passing truck driver who'd called for help on his CB radio. When I looked at David after hearing this news, his face had gone completely gray, and he was staring at the ground like he was trying to disappear. Amanda started crying, but they weren't tears of relief. They were tears of fear. The troopers arrested David that afternoon after finding the knife wrapped in the towel he'd retrieved from their cabin, and Amanda confessed that she'd helped him move Troy's body after the attack. She said David had snapped during an argument about money Troy owed him, and they'd panicked when they thought he was dead. The phone line had been cut with wire cutters found in David's bag. Amanda got a reduced sentence for cooperating, but David was charged with attempted murder. I quit my job the next day and never went back to Alaska. Sometimes I still wake up wondering what would have happened if that truck driver hadn't found Troy in time. Most summers, my Uncle Tim would take me out fishing somewhere remote in Alaska. He's the kind of guy who thinks Wi-Fi is a government trick, and that real life starts when your boots hit mud. That particular trip, we were camped just outside Bethel, along a bend in the Kuskokwim River where the bank slopes down in a jagged mess of roots and packed silt. I'd just turned 13 that spring, and it was my first time getting my own gear, rod, boots, even a small fillet knife. I remember feeling proud, like I'd finally earned a spot alongside the grown-ups, even if I still had to sleep in the smaller tent. It was early afternoon and Tim had hiked up river a ways to check some traps, leaving me with instructions not to wander far and to keep the fire going. The sun was out but hazy, filtered through low clouds that made everything look softer, quieter. I'd set up by the water with my tackle box and a half-warmed thermos of black coffee I wasn't really supposed to be drinking. The current was slow that day, dragging bits of moss and drift in wide arcs, and I remember watching the surface like it was a movie. No phone, no distractions, just that steady hush of water and wind. Then someone called out from the trees behind me. At first I thought it was Tim messing with me. The voice had that friendly but strained tone like someone trying not to spook a stray dog. When I turned, I saw a man standing halfway down the slope leading into the brush. He had on this camo jacket that looked like it had been dipped in mud and forgotten for years, and a wool beanie stretched over his head like he'd pulled it on, without checking if it fit. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't from the campgrounds, or from the small shop we stopped at in town. He smiled with his mouth open just enough to show a missing canine tooth, and said he was a local guide. Claimed he was moving gear for a group of hunters and needed a second pair of hands. There was something about how still he stood while talking that didn't sit right with me. His feet never shifted. His hands stayed behind his back even when he gestured with his chin toward the trees. I asked which outfitter he worked for, and he dodged the question like I'd asked for his social security number. Then he laughed, this dry, shallow sound, and said I looked strong enough to carry a couple crates. He pointed deeper into the woods, saying it wasn't far, just past a ridge. I remember feeling my knees tense, not with fear exactly, but like my body had already made a decision before my brain caught up. I told him I needed to grab my boots, stalling really, but he stepped forward like he hadn't heard me. Only a few feet, but it felt way too close. His boots sank into the soft dirt near the edge of the water, leaving deep, wide prints like he'd been pacing that shoreline for a while. That's when I noticed the back of his pants were soaked up to the thighs, and not from walking through shallow river water. It was darker, muddier, like he'd been kneeling somewhere wet for too long. He glanced toward the trail again, but there wasn't any gear in sight. Just thick brush and a mess of alder branches snapped low like someone had pushed through them fast and recently. I said no. I didn't even think about it. Just said it out loud, firm and clear, the way my uncle had told me to speak if something ever felt wrong. The man didn't respond right away. He just kept standing there, staring like I hadn't spoken at all. His face didn't change, but his jaw clenched once, quick. Then he sort of laughed through his nose and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn." That's when I backed away, careful not to turn around, keeping the river behind me as a kind of barrier. I felt this weird pressure, like I had to keep talking or moving or doing something, because silence felt dangerous. I walked backward until I hit a log that marked the trail back to camp. That's when he took one more step toward me, slow, deliberate, and said, "You don't want to be out here alone when it gets dark." It wasn't a threat, not exactly. More like he was stating a fact. His tone was flat and weirdly calm, like he was reciting a weather report. I didn't answer, I just turned and ran. Didn't check if he followed. I didn't hear footsteps, but I also didn't trust the quiet. The trees seemed thicker on the way back, like they were leaning in, and I remember ducking under branches that hadn't been low before. By the time I reached the tents, I couldn't tell if I'd been gone 10 minutes or an hour. Everything looked the same, but it all felt off balance, like the world had been nudged slightly sideways. I didn't see Tim anywhere, and for a second I panicked, thinking maybe that man had gotten to him too. But then I saw smoke curling up from the fire pit. He came out from behind the truck a few seconds later, holding a wrench, wiping grease off his fingers. He asked if I'd caught anything. I told him no, and that we needed to pack up early. He gave me a look but didn't argue. We left that same afternoon. Tim didn't press for details until we were halfway down the gravel road back toward town. I told him what happened, as straight as I could. He got real quiet, not angry, just focused, like he was already mentally reviewing maps and faces. He asked what the man looked like, what he said, and if I could point out the exact spot. I told him about the soaked pants, the missing tooth, the part where he kept his hands out of view. Tim didn't speak for a while after that. When we got to town, he made a quick stop at the ranger station while I waited in the truck with the windows cracked and my fishing rod still in the back seat, untouched. That night, back at the motel, the news was on in the background while we were eating. I was barely paying attention until Tim turned the volume up. A missing persons alert had gone out. Boy named Alex, 15, last seen just outside a different campsite, not far from ours, 4 days earlier. No solid leads, but the report mentioned he was last spotted talking to someone described as a man in camouflage, possibly local. The photo of the missing kid hit hard. He was taller than me, but something about his expression felt familiar. Just a regular teen trying to enjoy the outdoors, probably didn't expect his afternoon to turn sideways. I didn't sleep much that night. Kept thinking about how fast things could have gone bad if I'd said yes, if I'd followed, if I'd hesitated even a second longer. It's not like I did anything heroic. I just listened to that part of myself that tenses up when something isn't quite right. I still think about that man's voice sometimes, how calm it was when he told me I didn't want to be alone out there. Not angry, not frustrated, just certain. Like he wasn't guessing how things would end. He already knew. We haven't gone back to that spot since. Tim said we'd stick to places closer to town for a while. I never saw the man again, and as far as I know, no one was ever arrested. The other boy, Alex, was never found. His name comes up sometimes in forums like this, and every time it does, I think about saying something, about reporting the interaction again. But the truth is, I've already said what I know. And maybe posting here now is just a way to remind anyone reading. Trust that gut feeling, even if it doesn't make sense in the moment, especially when it doesn't. I still don't know why I didn't turn around that day. Part of me thinks it was just denial. I didn't want to admit something was wrong. We were supposed to be heading to a wrestling tournament in Soldotna, just me and my son, Mason. He was 16, big into sports, always tossing his gym bag in the back seat like he owned the world. I'd taken the weekend off from the dental office, packed us both up, filled the tank at a Chevron near Kenai Spur Road, and figured we'd make good time before sunset. The drive down from our town was familiar. We'd done it twice before for other school events. I remember telling myself it would be a quiet ride, maybe even a chance for us to talk without distractions. We were about 30 minutes south of Sterling when I noticed the pickup. It had dark-tinted windows and an older, matte gray paint job. Nothing flashy, just enough to blend in. It slipped into my lane behind us somewhere past the last gas station. At first, I didn't think much of it. The highway's long and mostly empty, and vehicles stick together sometimes for miles. But this one stayed close. Too close. I checked the mirror more than once, expecting it to pass. It never did. I even nudged over to the right shoulder, slowing down enough to invite it around. Instead, the driver matched my speed exactly, keeping the same tight distance, almost like he was tethered to us. I pointed it out to Mason, trying not to sound nervous. He was looking at his phone but glanced up and muttered something like, "Creeper vibes." He wasn't wrong. I tested it again, sped up a little, then dropped to under the speed limit. The truck mirrored everything. I tapped the brakes twice, a trick my dad used to warn tailgaters. No change. I switched lanes for no reason, still behind us. It wasn't aggressive, just deliberate. That's what made it worse. There was no honking, no flashing lights, no engine revving. Just that constant pressure behind us like we were being herded somewhere. I didn't want to panic in front of Mason, but I felt this cold realization start to grow. This wasn't just someone zoning out on the highway. It was too late to turn back, and cell signal was weak in that stretch. I told Mason to open the Maps app and look for the nearest place to pull over that had lights, maybe a store or a rest area. We found a rest stop about 10 minutes ahead. It was barely marked on the map, just a faded icon, but it was better than staying in motion with this guy glued to our bumper. I stayed calm, or at least tried to. My knuckles were starting to ache from how tightly I was gripping the wheel. The rest stop wasn't what I hoped it would be. It was a gravel pull-off with one flickering street lamp, a rusted vending machine that probably hadn't worked since the early 2000s, and a single unmarked porta-potty tilted slightly in the mud. No cars. No people. Just wind moving through the trees and the dull hum of the nearby river. I slowed down and pulled in anyway, thinking if the truck passed us, I'd just wait a few minutes before getting back on the road. But it didn't pass. It followed us in. Slow, steady, and confident. I felt Mason sit up straight. I could tell he was trying to act unfazed, but I saw the way he held his breath. The truck didn't park next to us. It angled itself behind my car, cutting off the exit like it had rehearsed the move. I didn't recognize the model exactly, older Chevy or GMC, maybe late 90s, but there was something strange about the front grille. It looked homemade, reinforced, like someone had welded extra bars across it. My headlights reflected off the tinted windshield, but I couldn't see inside. No movement, no door opening, just the truck sitting there, engine still on, low idle rumbling through the quiet like a warning. I told Mason, "Don't get out," and grabbed my phone. No signal. Mason whispered that he was already recording. He'd flipped his camera around and angled it low against the dashboard, barely moving his hand. I didn't even have to ask. He just did it. Smart kid. I told him to keep filming no matter what. I was about to honk, just once, to maybe scare whoever it was or alert someone nearby, even though I doubted anyone would hear. But before I could, the driver's side door of the truck cracked open. Not all the way, just a few inches. Then it shut again. Nothing else. No one got out. I couldn't explain the move, but it felt calculated, like they were letting us know they were watching, deciding. That was the moment it stopped feeling like paranoia and started feeling like a trap. I didn't want to reverse into them, but we were boxed in. There was a steep ditch to the right and dense trees on the left. I kept thinking, if I drive forward over the grass, I might get stuck. So I just stayed there, engine running, doors locked. The truck crept forward an inch, just one, and I couldn't help it. I yelled, "What the hell do you want?" Mason grabbed my arm, trying to calm me down, and whispered, "Mom, wait." The driver still didn't move. Just that engine, humming like it had all the time in the world. Out of pure instinct, I leaned on the horn, long and loud. It echoed across the trees and the empty highway beyond. That finally did something. The truck jolted back, then reversed fast, kicking up gravel behind it. It didn't leave the lot entirely. It stopped again by the exit, halfway turned toward the road like the driver couldn't decide whether to flee or wait. I put the car in drive, aimed straight at the ditch, and floored it. The wheels bounced hard over the edge, the undercarriage scraped, but we made it through the muddy patch and onto the far side of the rest stop. I didn't look back until I was on the highway again. When I checked the mirror, the truck was gone. Not on the road behind us, not in the lot. Just vanished. Mason stopped recording, and we drove the next 20 minutes in silence until we hit a more populated area, and I could finally breathe again. I pulled into a busy grocery store parking lot and made him send the video to my email just in case. We sat there for a while before I called the police. I didn't even care if they thought I was being dramatic. I knew what we'd just experienced wasn't normal. It wasn't road rage. It wasn't a prank. It was something darker. The trooper who met us took it seriously. I showed him the footage, and he actually recognized the truck right away. He didn't give us the full story, but he said the driver matched the description of someone they'd been trying to locate for months, connected to at least 3 other roadside harassment reports along the Kenai Peninsula. Always late afternoons, always targeting women driving alone or with kids. Nothing had escalated to violence, but the behavior was escalating. He said Mason's video was the clearest evidence they had so far, and that it might finally give them what they needed to make an arrest. We never heard what happened after that. They didn't follow up, probably for legal reasons, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again, not without someone in the passenger seat and a full tank of gas. Mason stopped asking for solo drives too. He still jokes that he saved the day with his camera. And maybe he's right. That little bit of instinct might have kept us from becoming another case they never solved. I just hope whoever was behind that wheel, whoever thought that kind of thing was a game, realized they picked the wrong car that night.